Dreamer, his female side was not nice. Applied to his anima, the dream statement hits the nail on the head when it says, "You are like a degenerate female." It hits him hard, as indeed it should. One should not, however, understand such a dream as evidence for the moral nature of the unconscious. It is merely an attempt to balance the lopsidedness of the conscious mind, which had the fiction that one was a perfect gentleman throughout. Such experiences taught me to mistrust free association. I no longer followed associations that led far afield and away from the manifest dream statement. I concentrated rather on the actual dream text as the thing which was intended by the uncan, and I began to circumambulate the dream itself, never letting it out of my sight, or as one turns an unknown object round and round in one's hands to absorb every detail of it. But why should one consider dreams, those flimsy, elusive, unreliable, vague, and uncertain phantasms, at all? Are they worthy of our attention? Our rationalism would certainly not recommend them, and the history of dream interpretation for Freud was a sore accent anyway, most discouraging in fact, most unscientific to say the least. Yet dreams are the commonest and universally accessible source for the investigation of man's symbolizing faculty, apart from the contents of neuroses, myths, and of the various arts. All these, however, are more complicated and more difficult to understand because, when it comes to the question of their individual nature, one cannot venture to interpret such unconscious acts without the aid of the originator. Dreams are indeed the chief source of all our knowledge about symbolism. One cannot invent wherever they occur. They have not been devised by conscious intention and willful selection, because, if such a doer had used, they would have been nothing but signs and abbreviations of conscious thoughts. Symbols to us spontaneously, as one can see in our dreams, which are not invented but which happen to us. They are not immediately understandable, they need careful analysis by means of association, but, as have said, not of free association, which we know always leads back eventually to the emotional thoughts or complexes that are unconsciously captivating our mind. To get there, we have no need of dreams. But in the early days of medical psychology, the general assumption was that dreams were analyzed for the purpose of discovering complexes. For this purpose, however, it is sufficient to conduct an association test, which supplies all the necessary hints as I have shown long ago. And not even this test is necessary, because one can obtain the same result by letting talk long enough. There can be no doubt that dreams often arise from an emotional disturbance in which the habitual complexes are involved. The habitual complexes are the tender of the psyche, which react most quickly to a problematical external situation. But I began to suspect that dreams might have another, more interesting function. The fact that they eventually lead back to the complexes is not the specific merit of dreams. If we want to learn what a dream means and what specific function it fulfills, we must disregard its inevitable outcome, the complex. We must put a check on limitless free association, a restriction provided by the dream itself. By FR association, we move away the individual dream image and lose sight of it. We must, on the contrary, keep close to the dream and its individual form. The dream is its own limitation. It is itself the criterion of what to it and of what leads away from it. All material that DC*S not lie within the SCOFN of the dream, or that oversteps the boundaries set by its individual form, leads astray and produces says nothing but the complexes, and we do not know whether they to the dream or not, since they can in so many other ways. There is, for instance, an almost infinite variety of images by which the sexual act can be symbolized, or rather allegorized. But the dream obviously intends its own specific expression in spite of the fact that the resultant will lead to the idea of sexual intercourse. This is no news and is easy to see. But the real task is to understand why the dream has chosen its own individual expression. Only the material that is clearly and visibly indicated as belonging to the dream by the dream images themselves should be used for interpretation. While free association moves away from the theme of the dream in mething like a zigzag line, the new myth slow, as I have always said, is more like a circumambulation, the center of which is the dream image. One concentrates on the specific topics, on the dream itself, and disregards the frequent attempts of the dreamer to break away from it. This ever-present neurotic dissociative tendency has many aspects, but at bottom it seems to consist in a basic resistance of the conscious mind to anything unconscious and unknown. As we know, this often fierce resistance is typical of the psychology primitive anxieties, which are as a rule conservative and show pronounced misoneistic tendencies. Anything new and unknown causes distinct and even fear. The primitive manifests all the reactions of a wild animal to untoward events. Our highly differentiated civilization is not at all free from such primitive behavior. A new idea that is not exactly in line with general expectations meets with the severest obstacles of a psychological kind. It is given no lit, but is feared, batted, and hoard in every way. Many pioneers can tell a story of misery, all due to the primitive misoneism of their contemporaries. When it comes to psychology, one of the youngest of the sciences, you can see misoneism at work, and in dealing with your own dreams you can easily observe your reactions when you have to admit a disagreeable thought. It is chiefly an all fear of the unexpected and unknown that makes eager to use free asphyxiation as a means of escape. I do not know how many times in my professional work have had to repeat the words, "Now let's get back to your dream." What does the dream say? If one wants to understand a dream it must be taken seriously, and one must also assume that it means what it manifestly says, since there is no valid reason to suppose that it is anything other than it is. Yet the apparent futility of dreams is so overwhelming that not only the dreamer but the interpreter as well may easily succumb to the prejudice of the nothing but explanation. Whenever a dream gets difficult and obstinate, the temptation to dismiss it altogether is not far away. When I was doing fieldwork with a primitive in East Africa, I discovered to my amazement that they denied having dreams at all. But by patient indirect talk I found that they had dreams all right, like else, but were convinced that their dreams meant nothing. Dreams of ordinary men mean nothing, they said. The only dreams that mattered were those of the chief and the medicine man, which concerned the welfare of the tribe. Such dreams were highly appreciated. The only drawback was that the chief as well as the medicine man denied having any more dreams, since the British were in the country. The district commissioner had taken over the function of the big dream. This incident shows that even in a primitive society dreams are ambivalent, just as in our society, where most people see nothing in dreams while a minority thinks very highly of them. The Church, for instance, has long known of somnia deo missa, dreams sent by God, and in our own time we have watched the growth of a scientific discipline which aims at exploring the vast field of unconscious processes. Yet the average man thinks little or nothing dreams, and even a thoroughly educated person shares the common ignorance and underrates everything remotely connected with the unconscious. The very existence of an unconscious psyche is denied by a great number of scientists and philosophers, who often use the naive argument that if there were an unconscious psyche there would be two subjects in the individual instead of one. But that is precisely the case, in spite of the supposed unity of the personality. It is, indeed, the great trouble of our time that so many people exist whose right hand not know what their left is doing. It is by no means the neurotic alone who finds himself in this predicament. It is not a recent development, nor can it blamed on Christian morality. It is, on the contrary, the symptom of a general unconsciousness that is the heritage of all mankind. The development of consciousness is a slow and laborious process that untold ages to reach the civilized state, which we date somewhat arbitrarily from the invention of writing, ATXUTNC. Although the development since that date seems to be considerable, it is still far from complete. Indefinitely large areas of the mind still remain in darkness. What we call psyche is by no means identical with consciousness and its contents. Those who deny the existence of the unconscious do not realize that they are actually assuming our knowledge of the psyche to complete, with nothing left for further discoveries. It is exactly as if they declared our present knowledge of nature to be the summit of all possible knowledge. Our psyche is part of nature, and its enigma is just as limitless. We cannot define nature or psyche, but can only state what, at present, we understand them to know. Man and his senses, therefore, could make such a statement as, there is no unconscious, i.e., no psychic contents of which he and others are unconscious, not to mention the mountain of convincing evidence that medical science has accumulated. It is not, of course, scientific responsibility or honesty that causes such resistance, but age-old Messianism, fear of the new and unknown. This peculiar resistance to the unknown part of the psyche has its historical reasons. Consciousness is a very acquisition and as such is still in men. By specific dangers, and easily injured. As a matter of fact, one of the most common mental derangements among primitives consists in the loss of a soul, which, as the term indicates, means a noticeable disunion of consciousness. On the primitive level, the psyche or soul is by no means a unit, as is widely said. Many primitives assume that, as well as his own, a man has a bush soul, incarnate in a wild animal or a tree, with which he is connected by a kind of psychic identity. This is what Lévi-Brul called participation mystique. Point 2. In the case of an animal, it is a sort of brother, so much so that a man whose brother is a crocodile is supposed to be safe while swimming across a river. In the case of a tree, the tree is to have authority over the individual like a parent. Injury to the bush soul means an equal injury to the man. Others assume that a man has a of souls, which shows clearly that the primitive often feels that he consists of several units. This indicates that his psyche is far from being safely synthesized. On the contrary, it threatens to fall asunder only easily under the onslaught of unchanged emotions. What we observe in the seemingly remote sphere of the primitive mind has by no means vanished in our advanced civilization. Only often. As I have said, the right hand does not know what the left is doing, and in a state of violent affect one frequently forgets who one is, so that people can ask, what the devil has got into you? We are obsessed and altered by our MCXDS, we can suddenly unreasonable, or extravagant facts unaccountably vanish from our memory. We talk about being able to control ourselves, but self-control is a rare and remarkable virtue. If you ask your friends or relatives, they may able to tell you things about yourself of which you have no knowledge. One almost always forgets or omits to apply to oneself the criticism that one hands out so freely to others, falling at by the mote in one's brother's eye. All these well-known facts show a doubt that, on the heights of our civilization, human consciousness has not yet attained a reasonable degree of continuity. It is still dissociable and vulnerable, in a way fortunately so, since the dissociability of the psyche is also an advantage in that it enables us to concentrate on one bent by dismissing everything else that might claim attention. It makes a great difference, however, whether your consciousness purposely splits off and suppresses a part of the psyche temporarily, or whether the same thing happens to you, so that the psyche splits spontaneously without your consent and knowledge, or perhaps even against your will. The first is a civilized achievement, the second a primitive and archaic condition or a pathological event and the cause of a neurosis. It is the loss of a soul, the symptom of a still existing mental primitivity. It is a long way indeed from primitivity to a reliable cohesion of consciousness. Even in our days the unity of consciousness is a doubtful affair, since only a little affect is needed to disrupt its continuity. On the other hand, the effect control of emotion, however desirable on one of view, would be a questionable accomplishment. For it would deprive course of all variety, color, warmth, and charm. Point 2. The functions of the unconscious are new treats the dream as a spontaneous percluct of the psyche about which there is no previous assumption except that it somehow makes sense. This is no more than every science assumes, namely that its object is worthy of investigation. No matter how low one's opinion of the unconscious may be, the unconscious is at least on a level with the louse, which, after all, enjoys the honest interest of the entomologist. As to the alleged boldness of the H.W. thesis that an unconscious psyche exists, I must emphasize that a more Vedist formulation could hardly be imagined. It is so simple that it amounts to a tautology. A content of consciousness disappears and cannot reproduce it. The best we can say of it is, the thought, or whatever it was, has become unconscious, or is cut off from consciousness, so that it cannot even remembered. Or else it may happen that we have an inkling or hunch of something which is about to break into consciousness, something is in the air, we smell a rat, and so on. To speak under these conditions of latent or unconscious contents is hardly a daring hypothesis. When something vanishes from consciousness it does not dissolve into thin air or cease to exist, any more than a car disappearing round a corner becomes non-existent. It is simply out of sight, and, as we may meet the car again, so we may come across a thought again which was previously lost. We find the same thing with sensation, as the following experiment proves. If you place a continuous note on the edge of audibility, you will observe in listening to it that at regular intervals it is audible and inaudible. These oscillations are due to a exreal increase and decrease of attention. The note never ceases to exist with static intensity. It is merely the decrease of attention that causes its apparent disappearance. The unconscious, therefore, consists in the first place of a multitude of temporarily eclipsed contents which, as Exenrens shows, continue to influence the conscious processes. A man in a distracted state of mind gcrs to a certain place in his obviously to fetch something. Then he suddenly stops. He has forgotten why he got up and what he was after. He gropes among a whole collection of objects, completely at sea as to what he wants to find. Suddenly he wakes up, having discovered the thing he wants. He behaves like a man walking in his sleep, oblivious of his original purpose, yet unconsciously guided by it. If you observe the behavior of a neurotic, you can see him apparently conscious and full acts, yet, when you ask him about them, you discover to your surprise that he is either unconscious of them or has something quite different in mind. He hears and does not hear, he sees yet is blind, he knows and does not know at the same time. Thousands of such observations have convinced the specialist that unconscious contents as if they were conscious, and that you can never sure whether thought or action is conscious or not. So obvious to yourself that you cannot imagine it to be invisible to any xxly can be as slow as non-existent to your fellows, and yet they behave as if they were just as conscious of it as you are yourself. This kind of has given rise to the medical prejudice that hysterical patients are confirmed liars. Yet the surplus of lies they seem to produce is due to the uncertainty of their mental state, to the discernibility of their consciousness, which is liable to unpredictable eclipses, just as their skin shows unex and changing areas of anesthesia. There is no certainty whether a needle prick will be registered or not. If their attention can be focused on a certain fkant, the whole surface of there may completely anesthetized, and, when attention relaxes, sense reception is instantly restored. Moreover, when one hypnotizes such cases, one can easily demonstrate that they are aware of everything that has been done in an anesthetized area or during an eclipse of consciousness. They can remember every detail just as if they had been fully conscious during the experiment. I recall a similar case of a woman who was admitted to the clinic in a state of still XR. Next day when she came to, she knew who she was, but did not know where she was nor how or why she had come there, nor did she know the date. I hypno.n. Symbols and the interpretation of dreams tized her, and she could tell me a verifiable story of why she fell ill, how she had got to the clinic, and who had received her, with all the details. As there was a clock in the entrance hall, though not in a very conspicuous place, she could also remember the time of her admission to the minute. Everything happened as if she had been in a completely normal condition and not deeply unconscious. It is true that the bulk of our evidential material comes from clinical observation. That is the reason why many critics assume that the unconscious and its manifestations belong to the sphere of psychopathology as neurotic or psychotic symptoms and that they do not occur in a normal mental state. But, as has been pointed out long ago, neurotic phenomena are not by any means the exclusive of disease. They are as a matter of fact normal occurrences pathologically exaggerated, and therefore just more obvious than their normal parallels. One can indeed observe all hysterical symptoms in a diminutive form in normal individuals, but they are slight that they usually pass unnoticed. In this respect, everyday life is a mine of evidential mate. Just as conscious contents can vanish into the unconscious, other contents can also arise from it. A majority of mere recollections, really new thoughts and creative ideas can appear which have never been conscious before. They grow up from the dark depths like a lotus, and they form an I'm1m. Part of the subliminal psyche. This aspect of the unconscious is of particular relevance in dealing with dreams. One must always bear in mind that dream material does not necessarily consist of ties, it may just as well contain new thoughts that are not yet conscious. Forgetting is a normal process, in which certain conscious contents lose their energy through a deflection of attention. When interest turns elsewhere, it leaves former contents in the shadow, just as a searchlight illuminates a new area by leaving another to disappear in the darkness. This is unavoidable, for consciousness can keep only a few images in full clarity at one time, and even this clarity fluctuates. As one have mentioned, forgetting may be defined as rarely subliminal contents remaining outside the range of vision against one's will. The forgotten contents have not ceased to exist. Although they cannot be reperclosed, they are present in a subliminal state, from 2. The functions of the TNA, NSC10 vs which they can rise up instantaneously at any time, often after many years of apparently total oblivion, or they can be fetched back by hypnosis. Besides normal forgetting, there are the cases described by Freud of disagreeable memories which one is only ready to lose. As Nietzsche has remarked, when pride is insistent enough, memory prefers to give way. Thus among the lost memories we encounter not a few that owe their subliminal state, and their incapacity to be at will, to their disagreeable and incompatible nature. These are the repressed contents. As a parallel to normal forgetting, subliminal sense-perceptions should mentioned, cause they play a not universal role in our daily life. We see, hear, smell and taste many things without noticing them at the time. Either in cause our attention is deflected or because the stimulus is slight to perclose a conscious impression. But in spite of their apparent non-existence they can influence consciousness. A well-known example is the case of the professor walking in the country with a pupil, deep in serious conversation. Suddenly he notices that his thoughts are interrupted by an unexpected row of memories from his early. He cannot account for it, as he is unable to discover any ascriative connection with the subject of his conversation. He stops and back, there at a little distance is a farm, through which they had passed a short while ago, and he remembers that soon afterwards images of his child slow to surge up. Let us go back to the farm, he says to his pupil, it must be about there that my fantasies started. Back at the farm, the professor notices the smell of geese. Instantly he recognizes it as the cause of the interruption. In his early youth he had lived on a farm where there were geese, whose characteristic smell had formed a lasting impression and caused the reproduction of the memory images. He had noticed the smell while passing the farmyard, subliminally, and the unconscious perception had called back long-forgotten memories. This example illustrates how the subliminal perception released early memories, the energetic tension of which proved to be strong enough to interrupt the conversation. The perception was subliminal because the attention was engaged elsewhere, and the stimulus was not strong enough to deflect it and to reach consciousness directly. Such phenomena are frequent in everyday life, but mostly they pass unnoticed. A relatively rare but all the more astonishing phenomenon that falls into the same category is cryptomnesia, or the concealed recollection. It consists in the fact that suddenly, mostly in the row of creative writing, a word, a sentence, an image, a metaphor, or even a whole story apf***s which may exhibit a strange or otherwise remarkable character. If you ask the author where this fragment comes from, he does not know. And it comes obvious that he has not even noticed it as anything here. I will quote one such example from Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. The author describes Zarathustra's descent to hell with certain characteristic details which coincide almost word for word with the narration in a ships from the year 1686. And thus spoke Zara. Those are now about the time that Zarathustra sojourned on the Happy Isles, It happened that a ship anchored at the isle on which the smoking mountain stands, and the crew went ashore to shoot rabbits. The tide hour, however, when the captain and his men were together again, they suddenly saw a man corning towards them through the air. And a voice said distinctly, "It is time. It is high est time." But when the figure drew close to them, flying past quickly like a shadow in the direction of the volcano, they recognized with the greatest may that it was Zarathustra. "Behold," said the old helmsman, "Zarathustra GCRS down to hell, Ustinus Karener. Blatter AUS Evers T. The four captains and a merchant. Mr. went ashore on the island of Mount Stromboli to rabbits. At 3 o'clock they mustered the crew to go at Ard. When, to their inexpressible astonishment, they saw two men flying rapidly towards them through the ATR. One was dressed in black, the other in grey. They came past them very closely, in the greatest haste, and to their utmost dismay descended into the crater of the terrible volcano, Mount Stromboli. They recognized the pair as acquaintances from London. When I read Nietzsche's story, I was struck by its style, which is different from Nietzsche's usual language, and by the strange images of a ship anchored off a mythological island, of a captain and his crew shooting rabbits, and of the descent to hell of a man who was recognized as an old acquaintance. The parallels with Kerner could not be a mere coincidence. Kerner's collection dates from about and is probably the only extant source of the seaman's yarn. At least I was certain that Nietzsche must have gleaned it from there. He retells the story with a few significant variations and as if it were his own invention. As it was in the year that I came across this case, I still had the opportunity to write to Elizabeth Forster Nietzsche, the author's sister, and she remembered that she and her brother had read the Blatter Aus Provorst when Nietzsche was 11 years old, though she did not remember this particular story. The why I remembered it was that I had come across Kerner's COL lection 4 years before, in a private library, and, as I was interested in the writings of the physicians of that time as the forerunners of medical psychology, I had read through all the volumes of the Blatter. Naturally I should have forgotten the yarn in the course of time. It did not interest me in any way. But in reading Nietzsche I suddenly had a sentiment du déjà vu, followed by a dim recollection of old-fashioned cut, and gradually the picture of Kerner's filtered into my con Benoit. Who a surprising parallel to Rider Haggard's she in his novel L'Atlantide, when accused of plagiarism had to answer that he had never come across Rider Haggard's and was entirely unaware of its existence. This case could also have TK and one of cryptomnesia, if it had not error an elaboration of a sort of representation collective, as Levi-Bruhl has named certain general ideas characteristic of primitive scriades. I shall be dealing with these later on. What I have said about the unconscious will give the reader a fair idea of the subliminal material on which the spontaneous of dream symbols is based. It is evidently material that owes its unconsciousness chiefly to the fact that certain conscious contents must necessarily lose their energy, i.e., the attention bestowed on them, or their emotional tone, in order to make RCXNN for new contents. If they were to retain their energy, they would remain above the threshold and one could not get rid of them. It is as if consciousness were a sort of projector that casts its light, of attention or interest, on new perceptions due to arrive presently as well as on the traces of former ones in a dormant state. As a conscious act, this paroxysm can understood as an intentional and voluntary event. Yet just as often consciousness is forced to turn on its light by the intensity in external or internal stimulus. This observation is not superfluous, for there are many PLE who overestimate the role of willpower and think nothing can happen in their minds that they do not intend. But, for the sake of psychological understanding, one should learn to discriminate carefully between intentional and unintentional contents. The former are derived from the ego personality, while the latter arise from a source which is not identical with the ego, that is, from a subliminal part of the ego, from its other side, which is in a way another subject. The existence of this other subject is by no means a pathological symptom, but a normal fact that can be observed at any time anywhere. I once had a discussion with one of my colleagues about another trickster who had done something I had qualified as utterly idiotic. This dissector was my colleague's personal friend, and moreover a believer in the somewhat fanatical creed to which my colleague subscribed. Both were teetotalers. He impulsively replied to my criticism, "Of course he isn't himself a highly intelligent man, I meant to say." I mildly remarked that the ass came first, whereupon he angrily denied ever having said such a thing about his friend, and to only ever at that. This man was highly regarded as a scientist, but his right hand did not know what his left was doing. Such are not fit for psychology and, as a matter of fact, do not like it. But that is the way the voice from the other side is usually treated. I didn't mean it, I never said so. And in the end, as Nietzsche says, memory prefers to give way. 3. The language of dreams. All contents of consciousness have been or can become subliminal, thus forming part of the psychic sphere which we call the unconscious. All urges, impulses, intentions, affects, all septions and intuitions, all rational and irrational thoughts, conclusions, inductions, deductions, premises, etc., as well as all categories of feeling, have their subliminal equivalents, which may subject to partial, or chronic unconsciousness. One uses a word or a concept, for instance, that in another connection has an entirely different meaning of which one is momentarily unconscious, and this can lead to a ridiculous or even disastrous misunderstanding. Even a MCST carefully defined philosophical or mathematical concept, which we are sure does not contain more than we have put into it, is nevertheless more than we assume. It is at the least a psychic event, the nature of which is actually unknowable. The very numbers you use in counting are more than you take them for. They are at the same time mythological entities, for the Pythagoreans they were even divine, but you are certainly unaware of this when you for a practical we are also unconscious of the fact that general terms like state, money, health, scriety etc. usually mean more than they are suffix, said to signify. They are general only because we assume them to so, but in practical reality they have all sorts of nuances of meaning. I am not thinking of the deliberate twisting of such concepts in their communist usage, but of the fact that even when they are understood in their prov*r sense they nevertheless vary slightly from person to person. The reason for this variation is that a general notion is received into an individual context and is therefore used in an individual way. As long as concepts are identical with mere words, the variation is almost imperceptible and of no practical, but when an exact definition or a careful explanation is needed, one can occasionally discover the most amazing variations, not only in the purely intellectual understanding of the term, but particularly in its emotional tone and its application. As a rule these variations are subliminal and therefore never realized. One may dismiss such differences as redundant or overnice distinctions. But the fact that they exist shows that even the most banal contents of consciousness have a penumbra of uncertainty around them, which justifies us in thinking that each of them carries a definite subliminal charge. Although this aspect plays little role in everyday life, one must bear it in mind when analyzing dreams. I recall a dream of my own that baffled me for a while. In this dream, a certain Mr. X was desperately trying to get me and jump on my back. I knew nothing of this gentleman except that he had succeeded in twisting something I had said into a rather grotesque travesty of my meaning. This kind of thing had frequently happened to me in my professional life, and I had never bothered to realize whether it made me angry or not. But as it is of practical importance to maintain conscious control of one's emotions, the dream 1m instantly brought up the incident again in the apparent disguise of a syllogism. This saying, common enough in ordinary speech, is, "Du kannst mir auf den Buckel stigen, you can climb on my back," which means, don't give a damn what you say. One could say that this dream image was symbolic, for it did not state the situation directly but in a roundabout way, through a concretized colloquial metaphor which I did not understand at first sight. Since I have no reason to believe that the unconscious has any intention of concealing things, I must be careful not to project such a device on its activity. It is characteristic of dreams to prefer pictorial and picturesque language to colorless and merely rational statements. This is certainly not an intentional concealment, It simply emphasizes our inability to understand the emotionally charged picture language of dreams. As daily adaptation to the reality of things demands accurate statements, we have learned to discard the trimming of fantasy, and have thus lost a quality that is still characteristic of the primitive mind. Primitive thinking sees its objects surrounded by a fringe of associations which have become more or less unconscious in civilized man. Thus animals, plants, and inanimate objects can acquire properties that are most unexpected to the white man. An external animal seen by day is, for the primitive, quite obviously a medicine man who has changed his shaylee, or else it is an exter animal or an animal ancestor, or somebody's bush soul. A tree can part of a man's life, it has a soul and a voice, and the man shares its fate, and so on. Certain American Indians assure you that they are red araras, parrots, although they are quite aware that they have no feathers and don't look like birds. In the primitive's world, things do not have the same sharp boundaries they do in ours. What we call psychic identity or participation mystique has iron stripicate off our world of things. It is exactly this halo, or fringe of consciousness, as William James calls it, which gives a colorful and fantastic ASFKCT to the primitive's world. We have lost it to such a degree that we do not recognize it when we meet it again, and are baffled by its incomprehensibility. With us such things are kept below the threshold, and when they Zion ally reap for our, we are convinced that something is wrong. I have more than once been consulted by highly educated and otherwise intelligent people because they had peculiar dreams, involuntary fantasies, or even visions, which shcxked or frightened them. They assumed that nobody in a sound mental condition could suffer from such phenomena, and that a person who had a vision was certainly pathological. A theologian I knew once avowed that Ezekiel's visions were morbid symptoms, and that when Moses and other prophets heard voices they were suffering from hallucinations. Naturally he got into a panic when some spontaneous events of this kind happened to him. We are so used to the rational surface of our world that we cannot imagine anything untoward within the confines of common sense. If our mind once in a while does something thoroughly unexpected, we are terrified and immediately think of a pathological disturbance, whereas primitive man would think of fetishes, spirits, or gods but would never doubt his sanity. Uxlearn man is very much in the situation of the old Entor who was himself a psychotic patient. When I asked him how he was, he replied that he had had a wonderful night disinfecting the whole heaven with chloride of mercury but had found no trace of God. What we find instead of God is or something worse, and the fear of has changed into a phobia or anxiety neurosis. The emotion remains the same, only its object has changed its name and nature for the worse. I remember a professor of philosophy and ecology who consulted me about his cancer phobia. He suffered from a compulsive conviction that he had a malignant tumor, although nothing of the sort was ever found in dozens of X-ray pictures. Asterisko, I know there is nothing, he would say, but there still might something. Such a confession is certainly far more humiliating to a strong intellect than the ear-leaf of a primitive that he is plagued by a ghost. Malevolent spirits are at least a perfectly admissible hypothesis in a primitive society, but it is a shattering experience for a civilized F***R son to have to admit that he is the victim of nothing more than a foolish prank of the imagination. The primitive phenomenon of obsession has not vanished, it is the same as ever. It is only interpreted in a different and more obnoxious way. Many dreams present images and associations that are analogous to primitive ideas, myths, and rites. These dream images were called archaic remnants by Freud. The term suggests that they are psychic elements left over from times long ago and still adhering to our modern mind. This point of view forms part of the prevailing depreciation of the unconscious as a mere appendix of consciousness or, to put it more drastically, a dustbin which collects all the refuse of the conscious mind, all things discarded, disused, worthless, forgotten, and repressed. This opinion had to be abandoned in more recent times, since further investigation has shown that such images and associations belong to the regular structure of the unconscious and can be observed more or less everywhere, in the dreams of highly educated as well as illiterate people, of the intelligent as well as the stupid. They are in no sense dead or meaningless remnants, on the contrary, they still continue to function and are therefore of vital value just because of their historical nature. They are a sort of language that acts as a bridge between the way in which we consciously express our thoughts in a more primitive, more colorful, and pictorial form of expression, a language that excels directly to feeling and emotion. Such a language is needed to translate certain truths from their cultural form, where they are utterly ineffectual, into a form that hits the nail on the head. For instance, there is a lady well known for her stupid prejudices and stubborn arguments. The doctor tries in vain to instill some insight. He says, "My dear lady, your views are indeed very interesting and original. But you see, there are many people who unfortunately lack your assumptions and have need of your forbearance. Couldn't you etc." He could just as well talk to a stone. But the dream follows a different myth. She dreams, there is a great social affair to which she is invited. She is received by her hostess, a very bright woman, at the door with the words, "Oh, how nice that you have come, all your friends are already here and are expecting you." She leads her to it, and the lady steps into a cowshed. This is a more concrete and drastic language, simple enough to be understood even by a blockhead. Although the lady would not admit the element of the dream, it nevertheless went home, and after a time she was forced to accept it because she could not help seeing the self-inflicted joke. The message of the unconscious is of greater importance than most people realize. As consciousness is said to all sorts of external attractions and distractions, it is easily led astray and seduced into following ways that are unsuited to its individuality. The general function of dreams is to balance such disturbances in the mental equilibrium by contents of a complementary or compensatory kind. Dreams of high vertiginous places, balloons, aeroplanes, flying and falling, often accompany states of consciousness characterized by fictitious assumptions, overestimation of oneself, unrealistic opinions, and grandiose plans. If the warning of the dream is not heeded, real accidents take its place. One stumbles, falls downstairs, runs into a car, etc. I remember the case of a man who was inextricably involved in a number of shady affairs. He div 10 erd an almost morbid inchen for dangerous mountain climbing as a sort of compensation. He was trying to get above himself. In one dream he saw himself stepping off the summit of a high mountain into the air. When he told me his dream, I instantly saw the risk he was running, and I tried my best to emphasize the warning and convince him of the need to restrain himself. I even told him that the dream meant his death in a mountain accident. 11. Symbols and the interpretation of dreams was in vain. 6 months later he stepped off into the air. A mountain guide watched him and a young friend letting themselves down on a roll in a difficult place. The friend had found a fold on a ledge, and the dreamer was following him down. Suddenly he let go of the rope as if he were jumping into the air, as the guide reported afterwards. He fell on his friend and went down and were killed. Another typical case was that of a lady who was living above herself in a fantasy of distinction and austerity. But she had shocking dreams, reminding her of all sorts of unsavory things. When put my finger on them, she indignantly refused to acknowledge them. The dreams then became menacing, full of references to the long lonely walks she in the WTNDS near the town, where she indulged in soulful musings. One saw the danger and warned her insistently, but she would not listen. A week later a sexual pervert attacked her murderously, and only in the nick of time was she rescued by some people who had heard her screams. Obviously she had a secret longing for some such adventure and preferred to pay the price of 2 broken ribs and the fracture of a laryngeal cartilage, just as the mountain climbed at least had the satisfaction of finding a definite way out of his predicament. Dreams prepare, announce, or warn about certain situations, often long before they actually happen. This is not necessarily a miracle or a precognition. Most crises or dangerous situations have a long incubation, only the conscious mind is not aware of it. Dreams can betray the secret. They often do, but just as often, they do not. Therefore our assumption of a benevolent hand restraining us in time is doubtful. Or, to put it more positively, It seems that a benevolent agency is at work sometimes but at other times not. The mysterious finger may even wient the way to perdition. One cannot afford to be naive in dealing with dreams. They originate in a spirit that is not quite human, but is rather the breath of nature, of the beautiful and generous as well as the cruel goddess. If we want to characterize this spirit, we would do better to turn to the ancient mythologies and the fables of the primeval forest. Civilization is a most extensive process, and its acquisitions have been paid for by enormous losses, the extent of which we have largely forgotten or have never appreciated. Through our efforts to understand dreams, we are acquainted with what William James has aptly called the fringe of consciousness. What the redundant and unwelcome accessories are, if studied more closely, the almost invisible conscious contents, i.e., their subliminal, they form the psychic material that must be considered as the intermediary between conscious contents, or the bridge that spans the gap consciousness and the ultimately physiological foundations of the psyche. The practical importance of such a bridge can hardly be overrated. It is the link between the rational world of consciousness and the world of instinct. The more our consciousness is influenced by prejudices, fantasies, infantile wishes, and the lure of external objects, the more the already existing gap will widen out into a neurotic disorientation and lead to an artificial life far removed from healthy instincts, nature, and truth. Dreams try to re-establish the equilibrium by restoring the images and emotions that express the state of the unconscious. One can hardly ever restore the original condition by rational talk, which is far too flat and dureless. But, as my examples have shown, the language of dreams provides just those images which appeal to the strata of the psyche. One could even say that the interpretation dreams enriches consciousness to such an extent that it relearns the forgotten language of the instincts. Insofar as instincts are physiological urges, they are perceived by the senses and at the same time manifest themselves as fantasies. But insofar as they are not perceived sensually, they reveal their presence only in images. The vast majority of instinctive phenomena consists, however, of images, many of which are of a symbolic nature whose meaning is not immediately recognizable. One finds them chiefly in that twilight realm, dim consciousness and the unconscious background of the dream. Sometimes a dream is of such vital importance that its message reaches consciousness no matter how uncomfortable or king it may from the standpoint of mental equilibrium and physiological health in general. It is much for the conscious and the unconscious to connect it and to move on parallel lines than for them to be dissociated. In this respect, the next lection of symbols can be considered a most valuable function. One will naturally ask, what is the of this function if its symbols should pass unnoticed or prove to be incomprehensible? But lack of conscious understanding does not mean that the dream has no effect at all. Even civilized man can, occasionally observe that a dream which he cannot remember can slightly alter his for better or worse. Dreams can be to a certain extent in a subliminal way, and that is mostly how they work. Only when a dream is very impressive, or relates itself often, do interpretation and conscious understanding come desirable. But in pathological cases an interpretation is and should be undertaken if there are no counter-indications, such as the existence of a latent psychosis, which is, as it were, only waiting for a suitable releasing agent to burst forth in full force. Unintelligent and incompetent application of dream analysis and interpretation is indeed not advisable, and particularly not when there is a dissociation between a very one-sided consciousness and a irrational or crazy unconscious. Owing to the infinite variety of conscious contents and their deviation from the ideal middle line, the unconscious compensation is equally varied, so that one would be hard put to it to say whether dreams and their symbols are classifiable or not. Though there are dreams and occasional symbols, better called motifs in this case, which are typical and occur often, most dreams are individual and atypical. Typical motifs are falling, flying, being chased by dangerous animals or men, being insufficiently or absurdly clothed in public places, being in a hurry or lost in a milling crowd, fighting with useless weapons or utterly defenseless, running and getting nowhere, and so on. A typical infantile motif is the dream of growing infinitely small or infinitely big, or of being transformed from the one into the other. A noteworthy phenomenon is the recurrent dream. There are cases of dreams repeating themselves from the days of childhood to the advanced years of adult life. Such dreams usually compensate a defect in one's conscious attitude, or they date from a traumatic moment that has left behind some prejudice, or they anticipate a future event of some intense. Myself dreamt of a motif that was many times over of years. It was that I discovered a part of a wing of my 90 house which I did not know existed. Sometimes it was the place where my parents lived who had died long. My father, to my great surprise, had a laboratory in which he studied the comparative anatomy of fishes, and where my mother ran a hostelry for ghostly visitors. Usually the wing or indel*endant guest house was an historical building several hundred years old. Long forgotten, yet my ancestral property. It contained interesting old furniture, and towards the end of this series of recurrent dreams I devoured an old library whose were unknown to me. Finally, in the last dream, 10frned one of the old volumes and found in it a profusion of the most marvelous symbolic pictures. When I awoke, my heart was pounding with excitement. Meantime this dream I had placed in order with an antiquarian bookseller abroad for one of the Latin alchemical classics. Had come across a quotation that I thought might connected with early Byzantine alchemy, and I wished to verify it. Weeks after my dream a parcel arrived containing a parchment volume of the 16th century with many most fascinating symbolic pictures. They instantly reminded me of my dream library. As the rediscovery of alchemy forms an intimate part of my life as a pioneer of psychology, the motif of the unknown annex of my house can easily as an anticipation of a new field of interest and research. At all events, from that moment 30 years ago the recurrent dream came to an end. SYMLLS. Like dreams, are natural perklux, but they do not occur only in dreams. They can occur in any number of psychic manifestations. There are SYMLM, like thoughts and feelings, SYMTX like acts and situations, and it often looks as if not only the unconscious but even inanimate objects were concurring in the arrangement of symbolic patterns. There are numerous well-authenticated stories of a CLCRK that stopped at the moment of its owner's death, like Frederick the Great's Exangelum CLCRK at Sans Souci, of a mirror that broke, or a boiling coffee IT that just or during a crisis, and on. Even if the skeptic refuses to credit such reports, stories of this kind are ever renewed and are told again and again, which is ample proof of their psychological importance, even though ignorant people deny their factual existence. The most important symbols, however, are not individual but collective in their nature and origin. They are found principally in the religions. The assumes that they are of divine origin, that they are revealed. The skeptic thinks they are invented. Are wrong. It is true that, on the one hand, such symbols have for centuries been the objects of careful and quite conscious elaboration and differentiation, as in the case of dog RNAs. But, on the other hand, they are representations collectives dating from dim and remote ages, and these are revelations only in the sense that they are images originating in dreams and creative fantasies. The latter are involuntary, spontaneous manifestations and by no means arbitrary and intentional inventions. There was never a genius who sat down with his or brush and said, "Now I am going to invent a SYRNTL." No one can take a more or less rational thought, reached as a logical conclusion or deliberately chosen, and then disguise it as a symbolic phantasmagoria. No matter how fantastic the trappings may 100k, it would still be a sign hinting at a conscious thought, and not a symbol. A sign is always less than the thing it hints to, and a SYMT_HJL is always more than we can understand at first sight. Therefore we never stop at the sign but go on to the goal it indicates, but we remain with the SYMTX.L because it promises more than it reveals. If the contents of dreams agree with the sex theory, then we know their essence already, but if they are, we at least know that we do not understand them yet. A symbol does not disguise, it reveals in time. It is obvious that dream interpretation will yield one result when you consider the dream to symbolic, and an entirely different one when you assume that the essential thought is merely disguised but already known in principle. In the latter case, dream interpretation makes no sense whatever, for you find only what you know already. Therefore I always advise my pupils, learn as much as you can symbolism and forget it all when you are analyzing a dream. This advice is so important in practice that I myself have made it a rule to admit that I never understand a dream well enough to interpret it correctly. I do this in order to check the flow of my own associations and reactions, which might otherwise prevail over my patient's uncertainties and hesitations. As it is of the highest therapeutic importance for the analyst to get the message of the dream as accurately as possible, it is essential for him to explore the context of the dream images with the utmost thoroughness. I had a dream while I was working with Freud that illustrates this very clearly. I dreamt that I was in my house, apparently on the first FLCXR, in a cozy, pleasant drawing room furnished in the style of the 18th century. I was rather astonished because I realized I had never seen this room before, and began to wonder what the ground floor was like. I went downstairs and found it rather dark, with paneled walls and heavy furniture dating from the 16th century or even earlier. I was greatly surprised and my curiosity increased, because it was all a very undiscovery. In order to become better acquainted with the whole structure of the house, I thought I would go down to the cellar. I found a door, with a flight of stone steps that led down to a large vaulted room. The floor consisted of large slabs of stone, and the walls struck me as very ancient. I examined the mortar and found it was mixed with splinters of brick. Obviously it was an old Roman wall. I grew excited. In a corner, I saw an iron ring in one of the stone slabs. I lifted it up and saw yet another narrow flight of steps leading down to a sort of cave which was obviously a prehistoric tomb. It contained 2 skulls, some ihs, and broken shards of tree. Then I woke up. If Freud, when analyzing this dream, had followed my method of exploring the context, he would have heard a far-reaching story. But I am afraid he would have dismissed it as a mere attempt to escape from a problem that was really his own. The dream is in fact a short summary of my life, the life of my mind. J grew up in a house 200 years old, our furniture consisted mostly of pieces about 100 years old. And mentally my greatest adventure had in the study of Kant, and the great news of the day was the work of Charles Darwin. Shortly for this I had been living in a still medieval world with my parents, where the world and man were still presided over by divine omnipotence and providence. This world had become antiquated and obsolete. My Christian faith had relativized by my encounter with Eastern religions and Greek philosophy. It is for this reason that the ground FLI.XR was so still, dark, and obviously uninhabited. My then historical interests had from my original preoccupation with comparative anatomy, and when I worked as an assistant at the Anatomical Institute, was fascinated by the bones of fossil man, particularly by the much discussed Neanderthalensis and the still more controversial skull of Dubois Pithecanthropus. As a matter of fact, these were my real associations to the dream. But I did not dare mention the subject of skulls, skeletons, or corpses to Freud, because I had learned that this theme was not popular with him. He cherished the peculiar idea that anticipated his early death. He drew this conclusion from the fact that I was interested in the mummified corpses in the so-called Blake-Keller in Bremen, which we had visited in 1909 on our trip to America. Thus I was reluctant to come out with my thoughts, since through recent experience I was deeply impressed by the almost unbridgeable gap between Freud's mental outlook and background and my own. I was afraid of losing his friendship if I should open up to him about my inner world, which, I surmised, would 100k very queer to him. Feeling quite uncertain about my own psychology, I almost automatically told him a lie about my free associations, in order to escape the impossible task of enlightening him about my very personal and utterly different mental constitution. I soon realized that Freud was seeking for some incompatible wish of mine. And so I suggested tentatively that the skulls might refer to certain members of my family whose death, for some reason, I might desire. This proposal met with his approval, but I was not satisfied with such a phony solution. While I was trying to find a suitable answer to Freud's questions, I was suddenly confounded by an intuition, the role which the subjective factor plays in psychological understanding. My intuition was so overwhelming that my only thought was how to get out of this Sibyl snarl, and I the easy way out by a lie. This was neither elegant nor morally defensible, but otherwise I should have risked a fatal row with Freud, and I did not feel up to that for many reasons. My intuition consisted in a sudden and most unexpected insight into the fact that my dream meant myself, my life and my world, my whole reality as against a theoretical structure erected by another, alien mind for reasons and pure ses of its own. It was not Freud's dream. It was mine, and suddenly I in a flash what my dream meant. I must apologize for this rather lengthy narration of the jam I got into through telling Freud my dream. But it is a good sample of the difficulties in which one gets involved in the course of a real dream analysis. So much depends on the arsenal differences between the analyst and the analysand. Dream analysis on this level is less a technique than a dialectical process between two personalities. If it is handled as a technique, the excularity of the subject as an individual is excluded and the therapeutic problem is reduced to the simple question, who will dominate whom? I had given up hypnotic treatment for this very reason, because I did not want to MLSE my will on others. I wanted the healing remsesses to grow out of the patient's own personality, and not out of suggestions of mine that would have only a passing effect. I wanted to protect and preserve my patient's dignity and freedom so that he could live his life by his own volition. I could not share Freud's almost exclusive interest in sex. Assuredly plays no small role among human motives, but in many cases it is secondary to hunger, the power drive, ambition, fanaticism, envy, revenge, or the devouring passion of the active impulse and the religious spirit. For the first time it dawned on me that before we construct general theories man and his psyche we should learn a great deal more the real human exing, rather than an abstract idea of Homo sapiens. Point 4. The problem of types in dream interpretation in all other branches of science, it is a legitimate procedure to apply an hypothesis to an impersonal object. Psychology, however, inescapably confronts us with the living relationship between two individuals, neither of whom can be divested of his subjectivity or in any way. They can mutually agree to deal with a chosen theme in an impersonal, objective manner, but when the whole of the personality becomes the object of their discussion, two individual subjects confront one another and the application of a one-way rule is excluded. Progress is possible only if mutual agreement can be reached. The objectivity of the final result can be established only by comparison with the standards that are generally valid in the social milieu to which the individuals belong, and we must also take their own mental equilibrium, or sanity, into account. This does not mean that the final result must be the complete collectivization of the individual, for this would be a most unnatural condition. On the contrary, a sane and normal is one in which people habitually disagree. General agreement is relatively rare outside the sphere of the instinctive qualities. Disagreement functions as a vehicle of mental life in a society, but it is not a goal. Agreement is equally important. Because psychology basically learns balanced opposites, no judgment can be considered final unless allowance is made for its reversibility. The reason for this lies in the fact that there is no standard intelve or outside psychology that would enable us to form a final judgment as to what the psyche is. Everything we can imagine is in a psychic state, i.e., in the state of a conscious representation. To get outside this is the whole difficulty of the physical sciences. Point 4. The problem of types in dream interpretation, in spite of the fact that the only reality is the individual, north-northeast generalities are necessary in order to clarify and classify the empirical material, for it would obviously be impossible to formulate any psychological theory, or to teach it, by describing individuals. As a principle of classification, one can judge any likeness or unlikeness if only it is general enough, be it anatomy, physiological, or psychological. For our which is mainly concerned with psychology, it will be a psychological one, namely the widespread and easily observable fact that a great number of people are extrovert and others introverted. There is no need for a special explanation of these terms as they have passed into common. This is one of the many generalities from which one can CHCXSE, and it is fairly suitable for our purpose in so far as we are seeking to the method of, an approach to, an understanding of dreams as the main source of natural symbols. As I have said, the process of interpretation consists in the confrontation of two minds, the analysts and the analysands, and not in the application of a preconceived theory. The analyst's mind is characterized by a number of individual peculiarities, perhaps just as many as the analysand's. They have the effect of prejudices. It cannot be assumed that the analyst is a Sullivan just cause he is a doctor and possesses a theory and a corresponding technique. He can only imagine himself to be superior if he ascerns that his theory and technique are absolute truths, capable of embracing the whole of the psyche. Since such an assumption is more than doubtful, he cannot really be sure of it. Consequently he will be assailed by secret doubts in adopting such an attitude, i.e. in confronting the human wholeness of the analysand with a theory and a technique, which are mere thsas, instead of with his own living wholeness. This alone is the equivalent of his analysand's experience and knowledge are nothing more than professional advantages on the part of the analyst that do not keep him safely outside the fray. He will be tested just as much as the analysand. Since the systematic analysis of dreams demands the confrontation of two individuals, it will make a great difference whether their type of attitude is the same or not. If both belong to the same type, they may sail along happily for a long time. But if one is an extrovert and the other an introvert, their different and contradictory ends may clash right away, particularly when they are unconscious of their own or are convinced that it is the only right one. Such a mistake is easily made. Because the value of the one is the non-value of the other. The one will the majority view, the other will reject it just because it is everybody's taste. Freud himself interpreted the introvert as an individual morbidly engrossed in himself. But introspection and self-knowledge can just as well of the greatest value. The apparently trifling difference here between the extrovert, with his emphasis on externals, and the introvert, who puts the emphasis on the way he takes a situation, plays a very great role in the analysis of dreams. From the start you must in mind that what the one appreciates may vary negative to the other, and the high ideal of the one can be an object of repulsion to the other. This becomes more and more obvious the further you go into the details of differences. Extroversion and introversion are just two among many peculiarities of human behavior, but they are often rather obvious and easily recognizable. If one studies extrovert individuals, for instance, one soon discovers that they differ from one another in many ways, and that being extrovert is a superficial and general criterion to really characteristic. That is why, long ago, I tried to find some further basic peculiarities that might serve the of getting some order into the apparently limitless variations of human personality. I had always been impressed by the fact that there are surprisingly many individuals who never use their minds if they can avoid it, and yet are not stupid, and an equal number who obviously do use their minds but in an amazingly stupid way. I was also surprised to find many intelligent and wide-awake people who lived, as far as one could make out, as if they had never learned to use their sense organs. They did not see the things before their eyes, hear the words sounding in their ears, notice the things they touched or tasted, and lived without being aware of their own. There were others who seemed to live in a most curious condition of consciousness, as if the state they had arrived at today were final, with no change in sight, or as if the world and the psyche were static and would remain so forever. They seemed devoid of all imagination, and entirely and exclusively on sense perception. Chances and abilities did not exist in their world, and in their chkslay there was no real tomorrow. The future was just the re-asterisk-tion of the past. What I am trying to convey to the reader is the first glimpse of the impressions I received when I began to observe the many I met. It soon became clear to me that the people who used their minds were those who thought, who employed their intellectual faculty in trying to adapt to fraught and circumstances, and that the equally intelligent who yet did not think, were those who sought and found their way by feeling. Now feeling is a word that needs some explanation. For instance, one speaks of feeling when it is a matter of sentiment, correlating to the French sentiment. But one also applies the same word to an opinion, a communication from the White House Mayorjan. The president uses it to express an intuition, I had a feeling. Feeling is often confused with sensation. Or one finally. What I mean by feeling in contrast to thinking is a judgment of value, agreeable or disagreeable, GCD or bad, and so on. Feeling so defined is not an emotion or affect, which is, as the words convey, an involuntary manifestation. Feeling as I mean it is a judgment without any of the obvious slily recessions that characterize an emotion. Like thinking, it is a rational function, whereas intuition, like sensation, is irrational. Insofar as intuition is a hunch, it is not a product of a voluntary act, it is rather an involuntary event, which depends on different external or internal circumstances instead of an act of judgment. Intuition is more like sense perception, which is also an irrational event insofar as it depends essentially on external or internal stimuli deriving from physical and not mental. These four functional types correspond to the obvious means by which consciousness obtains its orientation. Sensation, or sense perception, tells you that something exists, thinking tells you what it is, feeling tells you whether it is agreeable or not, and intuition tells you where it comes from and where it is go. The reader should understand that these four criteria are just so many viewpoints among others, such as willpower, temperament, imagination, memory, morality, religiousness, etc. There is nothing dogmatic about them, nor do they claim to be the ultimate truth about psychology, but their basic nature recommends them as suitable principles of classification. Classification has little value if it does not provide a means of orientation and a practical terminology. I find classification into types particularly helpful when I am called upon to explain irons to children or husbands to wives, and vice versa. JT is also useful in understanding one's own prejudices. Thus, if you want to understand another dream, you have to sacrifice your own predilections and suppress your prejudices, at least for the time being. This is neither easy nor comfortable, because it means a moral effort that is not everyone's cup of tea. But, if you do not make the effort to criticize your own standpoint and to admit its relativity, you will get neither the right information about, nor sufficient insight into, your analysand's mind. As you expect at least some willingness on his part to listen to your opinion and to take it seriously, the patient must be granted the same right, although such a relationship is indispensable for any understanding and is there. For a self-evident necessity, one has to remind oneself again and again that in therapy it is more important for the patient to understand than for the analyst's theoretical expectations to be satisfied. The patient's resistance to the analyst is not necessarily wrong, it is rather a sign that something does not click. Either the patient is not yet at a point where he would be able to understand, or the interpretation not fit, in our efforts to interpret the dream symbols of another person. We are particularly by an almost invincible tendency to fill the gaps in our understanding by projection, that is, by the assumption that what I think is also my partner's thought. This source of error can be avoided by establishing the context of the dream images and excluding all theoretical assumptions except for the heuristic hypothesis that dreams somehow make sense. There is no rule, let alone a law, of dream interpretation, although it 100k as if the general purpose of dreams is compensation. At least, compensation can be said to be the most promising and most fertile hypothesis. Sometimes the manifest dream demonstrates its compensatory character from the start. For instance, a patient with no small idea of himself and his moral superiority dreamt of a drunken tramp wallowing in a ditch beside the road. The dreamer says, in the dream, "It's awful to see how low a man can fall." JT is evident that the dream was attempting to deflate his exalted opinion of himself. But there was more to it than that. It turned out that he had a black sheep in the family. A younger brother who was a degenerate alcoholic. What the dream also revealed was that his superior attitude compensated the inferiority of his brother and of the brother who was also himself. In another case, a lady who was proud of her intelligent understanding of psychology kept on dreaming a certain woman whom she occasionally met in real life she did not like her, thinking her vain, dishonest, and an intriguer. She wondered why she should a person so unlike herself and yet, in the dream, so friendly and intimate, like a sister. The dream obviously wanted to convey the idea that she was shadowed by an unconscious character resembling that woman. As she had a very definite idea of herself, she was unaware of her own poor complex and her own shady motives, which had more than once led to disagreeable scenes that were always attributed to others but never to her own machinations. It is not only the shadow side that is disregarded and repressed, positive qualities can also be subjected to the same treatment. An instance of this would be seen in apparently mixlist, self-effacing man with winning, apologetic or deprecatory manners, who always takes a back seat though with seeming he never misses an opportunity to present. His judgment is well informed. Even Cornell *10 in apparently appreciative, yet it hints at a certain higher level from which the matter in question could dealt with in a far way. In his dreams he constantly meets great men such as in Alexander the Great. His obvious inferiority complex is clearly compensated by such momentous visitors. But at the same time the dreams raise the critical question, what sort of man must I be to have such illustrious callers? In this respect, they show that the dreamer nurses a secret megalomania as an antidote to his inferiority complex. Without his knowing it, the idea of grandeur enables him to immunize himself against all influences from his surroundings. Nothing penetrates his skin, and he can thus keep aloof from obligations that would to other people. He does not feel in any way called to prove to himself or his fellows that his superior judgment is based on corresponding merits. He is not only a bachelor, but mentally sterile as well. He only understands the art of spreading hints and whisperings all, his importance, but no monument witnesses to his deeds. He plays this inane game all unconsciously, and the dreams try to bring it home to him in a curiously ambiguous way, as the old saying goes, ducant volentem fata, nolentem trahunt, the fates lead the willing, but drag the unwilling. Hobnobbing with Napoleon or being on speaking terms with Alexander the Great is just the thing a man with an inferiority complex could wish for, a wholesale confirmation of the nest behind the scenes. It is true wish fulfillment, which anticipates an achievement without the merits that should lead to it. But why, one will ask, can't dreams be open and directed, and say it clearly without subterfuges that seem to mislead in an almost cunning way? I have frequently been asked this question and I have asked it myself. I am often surprised at the tantalizing way dreams seem to evade definite information or omit the decisive event. Freud assumed the existence of a special factor, called the CENSOR, which was supposed to twist the dream images and make them unrecognizable or misleading in order to deceive the dreaming consciousness about the real subject of the dream, the incompatible wish. Through the concealment of the critical int. It was supposed that the dreamer's sleep would be protected against the SHCXK of a disagreeable reminiscence. But the dream as a guardian of sleep is an unlikely hypothesis, since dreams just as often disturb sleep. It LCXKS rather as if, instead of an unconscious censor. Consciousness, or the dreamer's approach to consciousness, had itself a blotting out effect on the subliminal contents. Subliminality corresponds to what Janet calls abaissement du niveau mental. It is a lowering of the energetic tension, in which psychic contents sink below the threshold and lose the qualities they possess in their conscious state. They lose their definiteness and clearness, and their relations become vaguely analogous instead of rational and comprehensible. This is a phenomenon that can be observed in all dreamlike conditions, whether due to fatigue, fever, or toxins. But as SCX, and as their tension increases, they less subliminal, more definite, and thus more conscious. There is no reason to believe that the abaissement shields incompatible wishes from discovery, although it may incidentally happen that an incompatible wish disappears along with the vanishing consciousness. The dream, being a subliminal process, cannot perclose a definite thought, unless it should cease to a dream by instantly becoming a content. The dream cannot but skip all those ents that are particularly retant to the conscious mind. It manifests the fringe of consciousness, like the faint glimmer of the stars during a total eclipse of the sun. Dream symbols are for the most part manifestations of a psyche that is beyond the control of consciousness. Meaning and purposefulness are not prerogatives of the conscious mind, they operate through the whole living nature. There is no difference in principle between organic and psychic formations. As a plant percloses its flower, so the psyche creates its SYMTXLS. Every dream is evidence of this percess. Thus, through dreams, intuitions, impulses, and other simultaneous **nings, instinctive forces influence the activity of consciousness. Whether that influence is for better or worse depends on the actual contents of the unconscious. If it contains many things that normally ought to conscious, then its function twisted and prejudiced. Motives are that are not based on true instincts, but owe their activity to the fact that they have been consigned to the unconscious by repression or neglect. They overlay, as it were, the normal unconscious psyche and distort its natural function. Therefore it is usual for psychotherapy, concerned as it is with the causes of a disturbance, to urge in by eliciting from the patient a more or less voluntary confession of all the things he dislikes, is ashamed of, or fears. This is like the much older confession in the church, which in many ways anticipated modern psychological techniques. In practice, however, the procedure is often reversed, since overpowering feelings of inferiority or a serious weakness may make it very difficult, if not impossible, for the patient to face a still deeper darkness and worthlessness. One have often found it more profitable first to give a misative out to the patient, a foundation on which he could stand, for we approached more painful and debilitating insights. Take as a simple example the dream of exaltation, in which one has tea with the Queen of England, or is on intimate terms with the POF. If the dreamer is not a schizophrenic, the practical interpretation the SYMLL depends very much on the state of his consciousness. If he is obviously convinced of his greatness, a darn FR will indicate it, but if it is a matter of a worm already crushed by the weight his inferiority, a further lowering of his values would amount to cruelty. In the former case a reductive treatment will recommend itself. And it will easy to show from the excitive material how inappropriate and childish the dreamer's intentions are, and how much they emanate from infantile wishes to equal or superior to his parents. But in the latter case, wherein all feeling of worthlessness has already devalued every positive as FYCT. To show the dreamer, on top of it all, how infantile, ridiculous, or even perverse he is would quite unfitting. Such a procedure would only increase his inferiority, as well as cause an unwelcome and quite unnecessary resistance to the treatment. There is no therapeutic technique or dextrine that is generally applicable, since every case that comes for treatment is an individual in a specific condition. I remember a patient I had to treat over a period of 9 years. I saw him only for a few weeks each year, as he lived abroad. From the start I knew what his real trouble was, but I also saw how the least attempt to get closer to the truth was met by a violent reaction and a self-defense that threatened complete rupture between us. Whether I liked it or not, I had to do my best to maintain the rapport and to follow his inclination, submerged by his dreams, though this led the discussion away from the central problem that, according to all reasonable exhortations, should have discussed. It went so far that I often accused myself of leading my patient astray, and only the fact that his condition slowly but clearly improved prevented me from confronting him brutally with the truth. In the 10th year, however, the patient declared himself cured and freed from all symptoms. I was surprised and ready to doubt his statement. Theoretically he could not cured. Noticing my astonishment, he smiled and said, "And now I want to thank you quite particularly for your unfailing tact and patience in helping me to circumvent the painful cause of my neurosis. I am now ready to tell you everything about it. If had been able to do so, I would have told you right out at the first consultation. But that would have destroyed my RFT with you, and where would I have been then? I would have been morally bankrupt and would have LTXST the ground from under my feet, having nothing to stand on. In the course of the years have learned to trust you, and as my confidence grew my condition improved. I improved because my belief in myself was restored, and now I am strong enough to discuss the problem that was destroying me. He then made a devastatingly frank confession, which showed me the reasons for the peculiar course our treatment had followed. The original SHCRK had iron such that he could not face it alone. It needed the two of us, and that was the task, not the fulfillment of theoretical presuppositions. From cases like this I learned to follow the lines already indicated in the material presented by the patient and in his DISP.SI. Rather than commit myself to general theoretical considerations that might not 1K applicable to that particular case. The practical knowledge of human nature I have accumulated in the course of 60 years has taught me to regard each case as anew, for which, first of all, I have to seek the individual approach. Sometimes have not hesitated to plunge into a careful study of infantile events and fantasies, at other times I have begun at the top, even if this meant soaring into a mist of most unlikely metaphysical speculations. It all depends on whether I am able to learn the language of the patient and to follow the gropings of his unconscious towards the light. Demand one thing and some another. Such are the differences between individuals. This is eminently true of the interpretation of symbols. Two different individuals can have almost the same dream, yet if one is young and the other old, the problems disturbing them will be correspondingly different, and it would be absurd to interpret both dreams in the same way. An example that comes to mind is a dream in which a company of young men are riding on horseback across a wide field. The dreamer is in the lead and jumps a ditch of water, just clearing it. The others fall into the ditch. The young man who told me this dream was a cautious, introverted, and rather afraid of adventure. But the old man, who also had this dream, was bold and fearless, and had lived an active and enterprising life. At the time the dream, he was an invalid who would not settle down, gave much trouble to his doctor and nurse, and had injured himself by his disobedience and restlessness. Obviously the dream was telling the young man what he ought to do, and the old man what he was still doing. While it encouraged the hesitant young man, the old one would be only glad to risk the jump. But that still flickering spirit of adventure was just his greatest trouble. This example shows how the interpretation of dreams and symbols largely on the individual disposition of the dreamer. SYMTXLS have not one meaning only but several, and often they even characterize a pair of, as for instance, the stella matutina, the morning star, which is a well-known SYMTXL of Christ and at the same time of the devil, Lucifer. The same applies to the lion. The correct interpretation depends on the context, i.e., the connected with the image, and on the actual condition of the dreamer's mind. Point 5. The archetype in dream symbolism. The hypothesis we have advanced, that dreams serve the compensation, is a very broad and comprehensive assumption. It means that we believe the dream to a normal evocative phenomenon that transmits unconscious reactions or spontaneous impulses to the conscious mind. Since only a small minority of dreams are manifestly compensatory, we must pay particular attention to the language of dreams that we consider to symbolic. The study of this language is almost a science in itself. It has, as we have seen, an infinite variety of individual expressions. They can read with the help of the dreamer, who himself provides the associative material, or context of the dream image, so that we can look at all its aspects as if circumambulating it. This method proves to sufficient in all ordinary cases, such as when a relative, a friend, or tells you a dream more or less conversationally. But when it is a matter of outstanding dreams, of obsessive or errant dreams, or dreams that are highly emotional, the personal asphyxiations by the dreamer no longer suffice for a satisfactory interpretation. And such cars. We have to take into consideration the fact, already observed and commented on by Freud, that elements often occur in a dream that are not individual and cannot be derived from personal experience. They are what Freud called archaic, whose presence cannot explained by anything in the individual's own life, but seem to aboriginal, innate, and inherited patterns of the human mind. Just as the human LXX.ly represents a whole museum of organs, with a long evolutionary history them. We should the mind to be organized in a similar way rather than to a prince slucked without history. By history I do not mean the fact that the mind builds itself up through conscious tradition, language, etc. But rather its bile-percenticle, prehistoric. And unconscious development tx beginning with archaic man, whose psyche was still similar to that of an animal. This immensely old psyche forms the basis of our mind, just as the structure of our body is erected upon a generally mammalian anatomy. Wherever the trained eye of the morphologist looks, it recognizes traces of the original pattern. Similarly, the experienced investigator of the psyche cannot help seeing the analogies between dream images and the perklux of the primitive mind, its representations collectives, or mythological motifs. But just as the morphologist needs the science of comparative anatomy, so the psychologist cannot do without a comparative anatomy of the psyche. He must have a sufficient excellence of dreams and other products of the unconscious on the one hand, and on the other of in its widest sense. He cannot even see the analogy between a case of compulsion neurosis, schizophrenia, or hysteria and that of a classical demonic obsession if he has not sufficient knowledge of both. My views, the archaic remnants, which I have called archetypes or primordial images, are constantly criticized by who lack a sufficient knowledge of the cycle of dreams and of mythology. The term archetype* is often misunderstood XXL as meaning a certain definite mythological image or motif. But this would no more than a conscious representation, and it would be absurd to assume that such variable representations could inherited. The is, on the contrary, an inherited tendency of the human mind to form representations of mythological that vary a great deal without losing their basic pattern. There are, for instance, numerous representations of the motif of the hostile brothers. But the motif remains the same. This inherited tendency is instinctive, like the physic impulse of nest building, migration, etc. in birds. One finds these representations collectives practically everywhere, characterized by the same or similar motifs. They cannot assign to any particular time or region or race. They are without known origin, and they can reproduce themselves even where transmission through migration must be ruled out. My critics have also incorrectly assumed that by archetypes I mean inherited ideas, and on this ground have dismissed the concept of the archetype as a mere artistian. But if were ideas that originated in our conscious mind or were acquired by it, one would certainly understand them, and would not astonished and bewildered when they I can remember many cases of people who have stilted me they were baffled by their own or their children's dreams. The reason was that the dreams contained images that could not be traced to anything they remembered, and they could not explain where their children could have picked up such strange and incomprehensible ideas. These people were highly educated persons, sometimes psychiatrists themselves. One of them was a professor who had a sudden vision and thought he was crazy. He came to me in a state of complete panic. I simply a 400-year-old volume from the shelf and showed him an old woodcut that depicted his vision. You don't need to be crazy, I told him. They knew all your vision 400 years ago. Whereupon he sat down entirely deflated but once more normal. I particularly remember the case of a man who was himself a psychiatrist. He brought me a handwritten booklet he had received as a Christmas present from his daughter. It contained a whole series of dreams she had when she was 8 years old. It was the weirdest series I had ever seen, and Jay could well understand why her father was more than puzzled by the dreams. Childlike though they were a bit uncanny, containing images whose origin was wholly incomprehensible to her father. Here are the salient motifs from the dreams: to the bad animal, a snake-like monster with many horns, that kills and devours all other animals. But God comes from the four corners, being really four gods, and gives rebirth to all the animals. 2. Ascent into heaven where pagan dances are celebrated, and to hell where angels are doing good deeds. 3. A horde of small animals frightens the dreamer. The animals grow to enormous size, and one of them devours her. 4. A small mouse asterisk is penetrated by worms, snakes, fishes, and man beings. Thus the becomes human. This is the origin of mankind in 4 stages. 5. A drop of water is looked at through it is full of branches, this is the origin of the world. 6. A bad boy with of earth. He throws bits of it at the passers-by, and they all become bad. 7. A drunken woman falls into the water and comes out sober and renewed. 8. In America many opal are rolling in an ant heap, attacked by the ants. The dreamer, in a panic, falls into a river. 9. The dreamer is in a desert on the moon. She sinks so deep into the ground that she reaches hell. 10. She touches a luminous ball seen in a vision. Vapors come out of it. Then a man comes and kills her. She is dangerously ill. Suddenly birds come out of her skin and cover her completely. 12. Swarms of gnats hide the sun, and stars. All except one star, which then falls on the dreamer. In the unabridged German original, each dream begins with the words of the fairytale, once upon a time. With these words the little dreamer that she feels as if each dream were a fairytale, which she wants to tell her father as a Christmas present. Her father was unable to elucidate the dreams through their context, for there seemed to no sonal associations. Indeed, this kind of dream often seems to a just story, with very few or no ultaneous associations. The possibility that these dreams were conscious elaborations can of course ruled out only by someone who had an intimate knowledge of the child's character and did not doubt her truthfulness. They would, however, remain a challenge to our understanding even if they were fantasies that originate in the waking state. The father was convinced that they were authentic. And I have no reason to doubt it. I knew the little girl myself, but this was before she gave the dreams to her father, and I had no chance to question her about them, for she lived far away from Switzerland and died of an infectious disease a year after that Christmas. The dreams have a decidedly character, for their eating thoughts are in a way like philosophical problems. The first dream. For instance, Sirachs of an evil monster killing all other animals, but C.CXL gives rebirth to them through a kind of apokatastasis, or restitution. In the Western world this idea is known through Christian tradition. It can be found in the Acts of the Apostles 3:2j, Christ, whom the heaven must receive until the times of restitution of all things. The early Greek fathers of the Church, Origen, for instance, particularly insisted on the idea that, at the end of time, everything will be restored by the Redeemer to its original and perfect state. According to Matthew 1-7:11, there was already an old Jewish tradition that Elias truly shall first come, and restore all things. I Corinthians 15:22 refers to the same idea in the following words, "For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ shall all be made alive." One might argue that the child had met with this thought in her religious education. But she had had very little of this, as her parents, Protestants, belonged to those people, common enough in our days, who know the Bible only from hearsay. It is particularly unlikely that the idea of apokatastasis had been explained to her, and had become a matter of vital interest. Her father, at any rate, was entirely unaware of this mythical idea. 9 of the 12 dreams are concerned with the theme of destruction and restoration. We find the same connection in I Corinthians 15:22, where Adam and Christ, i.e., death and resurrection, are linked together. None of these dreams, however, shows anything more than superficial traces of a specifically Christian education or influence. On the contrary, they show more analogy with primitive tales. This is corroborated by the other motif, the cosmogonic myth of the creation of the world and of man, which appears in dreams 4 and 5. The idea of Christ the Redeemer belongs to the worldwide and pre-Christian motif of the hero and rescuer who, although devoured by the monster, again in a miraculous way, having overcome the dragon or whale or whatever it was that swallowed him. How, when, and where such a motif originated no one knows. We do not even know how to set about investigating the problem in a sound way. Our only certainty is that every generation, so far as we can, has found it as an old tradition. Thus we can safely assume that the motif originated at a time when man did not yet know that he accessed a hero myth in an age, therefore, when he did not yet reflect consciously on what he was saying. The hero figure is a typical image, an archetype, which has existed since time immemorial. The best examples of the floataneous of archetypal images are presented by individuals, particularly children, who live in a milieu where one can be sufficiently certain that any direct knowledge of the tradition is out of the question. The milieu in which our little dreamer lived was acquainted only with the Christian tradition, and very superficially at that. Christian traces may be represented in her dreams by such ideas as angels, heaven, hell, and evil, but the way in which they are treated points to a tradition that is entirely non-Christian. Let us take the first dream, of the God who really consists of four gods, coming from the four corners. The corners of what? There is no room mentioned in the dream. A would not even fit in with the picture of what is obviously a cosmic event, in which the universal being himself intervenes. The quaternity itself is a strange idea, but one that plays a great role in Eastern religions and philosophies. In the Christian tradition it has been superseded by the Trinity, a notion that we must assume was known to the child, but who in an ordinary middle-class milieu would be likely to know of a divine quaternity. It is an idea that was once current in circles acquainted with her Medic philosophy in the Middle Ages, but it petered out at the beginning of the 18th century and has been entirely obsolete for at least 200 years. Where, then, did the little girl pick it up? From Ezekiel's vision? But there is no Christian teaching that identifies the seraphim with girl. The same question may be asked about the horn set fnt. In the Bible, it is true, there are many horned animals, for instance in the book of Revelation, ch 13, but they seem to, although their overlord is the dragon, which in Greek, draken, means serpent. The horned serpent appears in Latin alchemy as the quadricornutus serpens, four-horned Sarah, symbol of Mercurius and an antagonist of the Christian Trinity. But this is an obscure reference, and, as far as I can discover, it occurs only in one author. In Dream 2 a motif appears that is definitely nori-Christian and a reversal of values, pagan dances by men in heaven and deeds by angels in hell. This, if anything, a relativization of moral values. Where did the child hit on such illusionary an idea, worthy of Nietzsche's genius? Such an idea is not strange to the philosophical mind of the East, but where could we find it in the child's milieu, and what is its place in the mind of an 8-year-old girl? This question leads to a further one: what is the Tory meaning of the dreams, to which the little girl obviously attributed so much importance that she gave them to her father as a Christmas present? If the dreamer had a primitive medicine man, one would not go far wrong in sing them to be variations on the philosophical themes of death, resurrection, or restitution, the origin of the world, the creation of man, and the relativity of values. Lao Tzu, high stands on low. One might well give up such dreams as hopeless if one tried to interpret them from a standpoint. But, as I have said, they undoubtedly contain representations collectives, and they are in a way analogous to the doctrines taught to young people in primitive tribes when they are initiated into man XD. At such times they learn about what God or the founding animals have done, how the world and man were created, what the end of the world will, and the meaning of death. And when do we, in our Christian civilization, hand out similar instructions? At the of adolescence. But many people begin to think of these things again in old age, at the approach of death. Our dreamer, as it happened, was in both these situations, for she was approaching and at the same time the end of her life. Little or nothing in the of the dreams points to the of a normal adult life, but there are many allusions to destruction and restoration. When I first read the dreams, I had the uncanny feeling that they foresled disaster. The reason I felt like that was the peculiar nature of the compensation that I deduced from the symbolism. It was the opposite of what one would expect to find in the consciousness of a girl of that age. These dreams end up anew and rather terrify. vision of life and death, such as one might expect in someone who lexks back life rather than forward to its natural continuation. Their atmosphere recalls the old Roman saying, Vita somnium breve, life is a short dream, rather than the joy and exuberance of life's springtime. For this child, life was a versacrum vivendum, a vow of a vernal sacrifice. Experience shows that the unknown approach of death casts an adumbratio, an anticipatory shadow, over the life and dreams of the victim. Even the altar in our Christian churches represents, on the one hand, a tomb, and on the other a place of resurrection, the transformation of death into eternal life. Such are the thoughts that the dreams brought home to the child. They were a preparation for death, expressed through short stories, like the instruction at primitive initiations, or the koans of Zen Buddhism. It is an instruction that does not resemble the Orthodox Christian doctrine but is more like primitive thought. It seems to have originated outside the historical tradition, in the matrix that, since prehistoric times, has nourished philosophical and religious relations about life and death. In the case of this girl, it was as if future events were casting their shadow ahead by arousing thought forms that, though not mally dormant, are destined to describe or accompany the approach of a fatal issue. They are to be found everywhere and at all times. Although the concrete in which they express themselves is more or less arsenal, their general pattern is lective, just as animal instincts vary a deal in different species and yet serve the same general sc. We do not assume that each newborn animal creates its own instincts as an individual acquisition, and we cannot suppose, either, that human beings invent and their physically human modes of recession with every new birth. Like the instincts, the collective thought patterns of the human mind are innate and inherited, and they function, when occasion arises, in more or less the same way in all of us. Emotional manifestations are based on similar patterns, and are the same all over the earth. We understand them even in animals, and the animals themselves understand each other in this respect, even if they belong to different species. And what atxut insects, with their complicated symbiotic functions? Most of them do not even know their parents and have nobly to teach them. Why should we suppose, then, that man is the only living creature deprived of specific instincts, or that his psyche is devoid of all traces of its evolution? Naturally, if you identify the psyche with consciousness, you can easily come to the erroneous idea that the psyche is a tabula corn, completely empty at birth, and that it later contains only what it has learned by individual experience. But the psyche is more than consciousness. Animals have little consciousness, but they have many impulses and reactions that denote the existence of a psyche, and primitives do a lot of things whose meaning is unknown to them. You may ask many civilized in vain for the reason and meaning of the Christmas tree or of the colored eggs at Easter, because they have no idea the meaning of these customs. The fact is, they do things without knowing why they do them. I am inclined to believe that things were generally done first and that only a long time afterwards asked a question about them, and then eventually discovered why they were done. The medical psychologist is constantly confronted with otherwise intelligent patients who behave in a peculiar way and have no inkling of what they do. We have dreams whose meaning us entirely, even though we may be firmly convinced that the dream has a definite meaning. We feel it is important or even terrifying, but why? Regular observation of such facts has enforced the thesis of an unconscious psyche, the contents of which seem to have approximately the same variety as those of consciousness. We know that consciousness in large measure on the coelaboration of the unconscious. When you make a slow reach, the next sentence is prepared while you but this preparation is mostly unconscious. If the unconscious not collaborate and withholds the next sentence, you are stuck. You want to quote a name, or a term otherwise familiar to you, but nothing is forthcoming. The unconscious dares not deliver it. You want to introduce Sorna Tenkei whom you know well, but his name has vanished, as if you had never known it. Thus you delcrate on the will of your unconscious. Any time the unconscious chkths, it can defeat your otherwise memory, or put something into your mouth that you did not intend at all. It can perclose unpredictable and unreasonable in effects and thus cause all sorts of complications. Superficially, such reactions and impulses seem to have an intimately personal nature and are therefore to entirely individual. In reality, they are based on a preformed and ever-ready instinctive system with its own characteristic and universally understandable thought forms, reflexes, attitudes, and gestures. These follow a pattern that was laid down long before there was any trace of a reflective consciousness. It is even conceivable that the latter originated in violent emotional clashes and their often disastrous consequences. Take the case of the savage who, in a moment of anger and disappointment at having caught no fish, strangles his much only son, and is then seized with immeasurable regret as he holds the little dead in his arms. Such a man has a great chance to the agony of this moment forever. This could have the beginning of a reflective consciousness. At all events, the SHRORK of a similar emotional experience is often needed to make people wake up and pay attention to what they are doing. I would mention the famous case of the Spanish Hidalgo, Ramon Lull, who after a long chase finally succeeded in meeting his lady at a secret rendezvous. Silently she opened her garment and showed him her cancer-eaten bosom. The shock changed his life, he became a holy man. Often in the case of these sudden transformations one can prove that an archetype has been at work for a long time in the unconscious, skillfully arranging circumstances that will unavoidably lead to a crisis. It is not rare for the development to manifest itself so clearly, for instance in a series of dreams, that the catastrophe can be predicted with reasonable certainty. One can conclude from experiences such as these that archetypal forms are not just static patterns, but dynamic factors that manifest themselves in spontaneous impulses, just as instincts do. Certain dreams, visions, or thoughts can suddenly appear, and in spite of careful investigation one cannot find out what causes them. This does not mean that they have no cause, they certainly have, but it is so remote or obscure that one cannot see what it is. One must wait until the dream and its meaning are sufficiently understood, or until some external event occurs that will explain the dream. Our conscious thoughts often concern themselves with the future and its possibilities, and so the unconscious and its dreams. There has long a worldwide belief that the chief function of dreams is prognostication of the future. In antiquity, and still in the Middle Ages, dreams played their part in medical. I can confirm from a Nuxlearn dream or rather precognition, in an old dream quoted by Artemidoros of Daldis. In the 2nd century AD, he relates that a man dreamed he saw his father die in the flames of a house on fire. Not long afterwards, he himself died of a phlegmon, fire, high fever, presumably pneumonia. Now it so happened that a colleague of mine was suffering from a deadly gangrenous fever, in fact, a phlegmon. A former patient of his, who had no knowledge of the nature of the doctor's illness, dreamed that the doctor was perishing in a great fire. The dream occurred 3 weeks the doctor died. At a time when he had just entered the hospital and the disease was only at its beginning. The dreamer knew nothing but the bare fact that the deceased was ill and had entered hospital. As this example shows, dreams can have an anticipatory or prognostic, and their interpreter will well advised to take this aspect into account. Particularly when an obviously meaningful dream does not yield a context sufficient to explain it. Such a dream often comes right out of the blue, and one wonders what could have prompted it. Of course, if one knew its ultimate outcome, the cause would clear. It is only our conscious mind that does not know. The unconscious seems already informed, and to have submitted the case to a careful prognostic examination, more or less in the way consciousness would have done if it had known the relevant facts. But, precisely because they were subliminal, they could perceived by the unconscious and submitted to a sort of examination that anticipates their ultimate result. Far as one can make out from dreams, the unconscious in its delicate rations percreeds in an instinctive way rather than along rational lines. The latter way is the prerogative of consciousness, which selects with reason and knowledge. But the unconscious is guided chiefly by instinctive trends, represented by corresponding thought forms, the archetypes. It looks as if it were a who had at work rather than a rational DCXT or who would sl*ak of infection, fever, toxins, etc., whereas the dream describes the diseased as a man's earthly house, and the fever as the heat of a conflagration that is destroying the house and its inhabitant. As this dream shows, the archetypal mind has handled the situation in the same way as it did at the time of Artemidorus. A situation of a more or less unknown nature has an intuitive ligrislicade by the unconscious and submitted to an archetypal treatment. This shows clearly that, in place of the raisonnement which consciousness would have applied, the archetypal mind has autonomously taken over the task of prognostication. The archetypals have their own initiative and their own specific energy, which enable them not only to perxlose a meaningful interpretation, in their own style, but also to intervene in a given situation with their own impulses and thought forms. In this they function like complexes, which also enjoy a certain autonomy in everyday life. They come and go very much as they please, and they often interfere with our conscious intentions in an embarrassing way. One can perceive the specific energy of the archetypes when the peculiar feeling of numinosity that accompanies them, the fascination or that emanates from them. This is also characteristic of the personal complexes, whose haveur may be compared with the role played by the archetypal representations collectives in the social life of all times. As zonal complexes have their individual history, so do social complexes of an archetypal character. But while personal complexes never produce more than a personal bias, archetypes create myths, religions, and philosophical ideas that influence and set their stamp on whole nations, and just as the of complexes can as conversations of one-sided or faulty attitudes of consciousness, so myths of a religious nature can interpret it as a sort of mental therapy for the sufferings of mankind, such as hunger, disease, old age, and death. The universal hero myth, for example, shows the picture of a man who vanquishes evil in the form dragons, secrets, monsters, demons, and enemies of all kinds, and who liberates his people from destruction and death. The narration or ritual repetition of sacred texts and ceremonies, and the worship of such a figure with dances, music, hymns, prayers, and sacrifices, grip the audience with numinous emotions and exalt the participants to identification with the hero. If we contemplate such a situation with the eyes of a believer, we can understand how the ordinary man is gripped, freed from his impotence and misery, and rise to an almost Saruran status, at least for the time being. And often enough he is sustained by such a conviction for a long time. An initiation of this kind loses a lasting impression, and may even create an attitude that gives a certain form and style to the life of a city. I would mention as an example the Eleusinian mysteries, which were finally suppressed at the beginning of the 7th century. They formed, together with the Delphic oracle, the essence and spirit of ancient Greece. On a much greater scale, the Christian era owes its name and significance to another antique mystery, that of the which has its rcks in the archetypal Osiris-Horus myth of ancient Egypt. It is nowadays a common prejudice to assume that once, in an obscure prehistoric time, the basic, mythological ideas were invented by a clever old philosopher or prophet, and ever afterwards believed by credulous and uncritical, although the stories told by a power-seeking priest Hoxlow were not really true but mere wishful thinking. The word invent is derived from the Latin invenire and means, in the first place, to come of xen or to find something, and, in the second, to find something by seeking for it. In the latter case, it is not a matter of finding or coming something by mere chance, for there is a sort of foreknowledge or a faint inkling of the thing you are going to find. When we contemplate the strange ideas in the dreams of the little girl, it seems unlikely that she sought them, as she was rather surprised at finding them. They occurred to her rather as strange and stories that seemed noteworthy and interesting enough to give to her father as a Christmas present. In doing so, she lifted them up into the sphere of our still living Christian mystery, the birth of our Lord, blended with the secret of the evergreen tree that carries the newborn light. Although there is ample historical evidence for the symbolic relationship Christ and the tree, the little girl's parents would have been badly embarrassed had they been asked to explain exactly what they meant by decorating a tree with burning candles to celebrate the nativity of Christ. "Oh, it's just a Christmas custom," they would have said. A serious answer would require a far-reaching dissertation on the symbolism of the dying God in antiquity, in the Near East, and its relation to the cult of the Great Mother and her symbol, the tree to men. Shin only one is elsked of this complicated problem. The further we delve into the origins of a representation collective or, in ecclesiastical language, of a dogma, the more we uncover a seemingly limitless web of archetypal patterns that, before modern times, were never the object of conscious reflection. Thus, paradoxically enough, we know more about mytho-percentical symbolism than did any age before our own. The fact is that in former times men lived their symbols rather than reflected them. I will illustrate this by an experience I once had with the primitives on Mount Elgon in East Africa. Every morning at dawn they leave their huts and breathe or spit into their hands, stretching them out to the first rays of the sun, as if they were offering either their breath or their spittle to the rising god Mungu. This Swahili word, which they used in explaining the ritual act, is derived from a Polynesian equivalent to mana or mulungu. These and similar terms designate a power of extraordinary efficacy, an all-pervading essence which we would call divine. Thus the word Mungu was their equivalent for Allah or Gqui. When I asked them what they meant by this act and why they did it, they were completely baffled. They could only say, "We have always done it. It has always been done when the sun rises." They laughed at the obvious conclusion that the sun is Mungu. The sun is not Mungu when it is above the horizon. Mungu is the actual moment of the sunrise. What they were doing was obvious to me but not to them. They just do it, they never reflect on what they are doing, and are consequently unable to explain themselves. They are evidently just what they have always done at sunrise, no doubt with a certain emotion and by no means merely mechanically, for they live it while we reflect on it. Thus I knew that they were offering their souls to Mungu, the breath of life, and the spittle means soul substance. Breathing or spit. Ting on something conveys a magical effect, as, for instance, when Christ used spittle to heal the blind. Or when a son inhales his dying father's last breath in order to take over the father's soul. It is most unlikely that these primitives ever, even in the remote past, knew any more the meaning of their ceremony. On the contrary, their ancestors probably knew even less, because they were more profoundly unconscious and thought if possible even less about their doings. Faust aptly says, "One man fang war die tat, in the ning was the deed." Deeds were never invented, they were done. Thoughts, on the other hand, are a relatively late discovery. They were found, and then they were sought and found. Yet unreflected life existed long before man, it was not invented, but in it man found himself as an afterthought. First he was moved to deeds by unconscious factors, and only a long time afterwards did he begin to reflect about the causes that had moved him. Then it took him a very long time indeed to arrive at the preposterous idea that he must have moved himself, his mind unable to see any other motivating force than his own. We would laugh at the idea of a plant or an animal inventing itself, yet there are many who that the psyche or the mind invented itself and thus brought itself into iking. As a matter of fact, the mind has grown to its present state of consciousness as an acorn grows into an oak or as saurians develop *d into mammals. As it has been, so it is still, and thus we are moved by forces from within as well as from without. In a mythological age these forces were called mana, spirits, demons, and gods, and they are as active today as they ever were. If they conform to our wishes, we call them happy hunches or impulses and pat ourselves on the back for eking smart fellows. If they go against us, then we say it is just bad luck, or that certain have it in for us, it must be pathological. The one thing we refuse to admit is that we are dependent, beyond our control. It is true that civilized man has acquired a certain amount of willpower which he can apply where he pleases. We have learned to do our work efficiently without having recourse to chanting and drumming to hypnotize us into the state of doing. We can even dispense with the daily prayer for divine aid. We can carry out what we propose to do, and it seems self-evident that an idea can translate it into action without a hitch, whereas the primitive is fed at every step by doubts, fears, and superstitions. The motto "where there's a will there's a way" is not just a Germanic prejudice, it is the superstition of man in general. In order to maintain his credo, he cultivates a remarkably lack of introspection. He is blind to the fact that, with all his rationality and efficiency, he is possessed by powers beyond his control. The gods and demons have not disappeared at all, they have merely got NCW names. They keep him on the run with restlessness, vague apprehensions, psychological complications, an invincible need for pills, alcohol, tobacco, dietary and other hygienic systems and ALXVE, all, with an impressive array of. I once met a drastic example of this in a professor of philo-phy and psychology in which the unconscious had not yet arrived. He was the man I mentioned who was obsessed by the idea that he had cancer, although X-rays had proved to him that it was all imaginary. Who or what caused this idea? It obviously derived from a fear that was not caused by observation of the facts. It suddenly overcame him, and then remained. Symptoms of this kind are extraordinarily obstinate and often enough hinder the patient from getting the proper treatment. For what would psychotherapy be in dealing with a malignant tumor? Such a dangerous thing could only be operated on without delay. To the professor's relief, every new authority assured him that there was no trace of cancer. But the very next day the doubt began nagging again, and he was plunged once more into the night of unmitigated fear. The morbid thought had a LXWER of its own that he could not control. It was not foreseen in his philosophical brand of psychology, where everything flowed neatly from consciousness, and the professor admitted that his case was pathological, but there his thinking stopped, because it had arrived at the sacrosanct TX between the philosophical and the medical faculty. The one deals with normal and the other with abnormal contents, unknown in the philosopher's world. This compartment psychology reminds me of another case. It was that of an alcoholic who had come under the laudable influence of a certain religious movement and, fascinated by its enthusiasm, had forgotten he needed a drink. He was obviously and miraculously cured by Jesus, and accordingly was held up as a witness to divine grace or to the efficacy of the said organization. After a few weeks of public confession, the novelty to wear off and some alcoholic refreshment seemed to indicate. But this time the helpful organization came to the conclusion that the case was pathological and not suitable for an intervention by Jesus. So they put him in a clinic to let the Tor do better than the divine healer. This is an ASJXCT of the modern cultural mind that is well worth into. It shows an alarming degree of dissociation and confusion. We believe exclusively in consciousness and free will, and are no longer aware of the powers that control us to an indefinite degree, outside the narrow domain where we can reasonable and exercise a certain amount of free choice and self-control. In our time of general disorientation, it is necessary to know about the true state of human affairs, which depends so much on the mental and moral qualities of the individual and on the human psyche in general. But if we are to see things in their right, we need to understand the past of man as well as his present. That is why a correct understanding of myths and symbols is of essential importance. E.6. The function of religious symbols. Although our civilized consciousness has separated itself from the instincts, the instincts have not, they have merely lost their contact with consciousness. They are thus forced to assert themselves in an indirect way, through what Janet called automatisms. These take the form of symptoms in the case of a neurosis or, in normal cases, of incidents of various kinds, like unaccountable forgetfulness, mistakes and so on. Such manifestations show very clearly the autonomy of the it. Is easy to believe that one is master in one's own house, but, as long as we are unable to control our emotions and our NCXXLS, or to be conscious of the myriad secret ways in which unconscious factors insinuate themselves into our arrangements and decisions, we are certainly not the masters. On the contrary, we have so much reason for uncertainty that it will k twice at what we are doing. The exploration of one's conscience, however, is not a lar pastime, although it would most necessary particularly in our time when man is threatened with self-created and deadly dangers that are growing beyond his control. If, for a moment, we at mankind as one individual, we see that it is like a man carried away by unconscious, he is like a neurotic, with the Iron Curtain marking the line of division. Western man, representing the kind of consciousness hitherto regarded as valid, has become increasingly aware of the aggressive will to ease war of the East, and he sees himself forced to take extraordinary measures of defense. What he fails to see is that it is his own vices, publicly repudiated and covered up by good international manners, that are thrown back in his face through their shameless inapplication by the East. What the West has tolerated, but only secretly, and indulged in a bit shamefacedly, the diplomatic lie, the double cross, veiled threats, comes back openly and in full measure and gets us tied up in knots. Exactly the case of the neurotic. It is the face of our own shadow that glowers at us across the Iron Curtain. This state of affairs explains the feeling of helplessness that is creeping over our Western consciousness. We are beginning to realize that the conflict is in reality a moral and mental problem, and we are trying to find some answer to it. We grow increasingly aware that the nuclear deterrent is a desperate and undesirable answer, as it cuts both ways. We know that moral and mental remedies would be more effective because they could provide us with a psychic immunity to the ever-increasing infection. But all our attempts have proved to be singularly ineffectual, and will continue to do so as long as we try to convince the world that it is only they, our opponents, who are all wrong, morally and philosophically. We expect them to see and understand where they are wrong, instead of making a serious effort ourselves to recognize our own shadow and its nefarious doings. If we could only see our shadow, we should be immune to any moral and mental infection and insinuation. But as long as this is not so, we lay ourselves to every infection because we are doing practically the same things as they are, only with the additional disadvantage that we neither see nor want to understand what we are doing under the cloak of GDXD manners. The East has one big myth which we call an illusion in the vein H0FR that our superior judgment will make it dissimulate. This myth is the time-hallowed archetypal dream of a golden age or a paradise on earth, where everything is provided for everybody, and one great, just, and wise chief rules over a human kindergarten. This werewolful archetype in its infantile form has got them all right, but it won't from the world at the mere sight of our superior of view. We even support it by our own childishness, for our Western civilization is in the grip of the same mythology. We cherish the same prejudices, hopes, and expectations. We believe in the welfare state, in universal race, in more or less equality for man, in his eternal human rights, in justice and truth, and, not loud, in the kingdom of on earth. The sad truth is that man's real life of inexorable sights day and night, well-being and suffering, birth and death, and evil. We are not even sure that the one will prevail against the other, that GCK, will overcome evil, or joy defeat pain. Life and the world are a battleground, have always taken and always will be, and, if it were not so, existence would come to an end. It is for this reason that a superior religion like Christianity expected an early end to this world, and Buddhism actually puts an end to it by turning its back on all desires. These categorical answers would be frankly suicidal if they were not you end up with the peculiar moral ideas and practices that constitute the of religions. I mention this because in our time there are countless people who have lost faith in one or other of the world religions. They do not understand them any longer. While life runs srncthly, the loss remains as good as unnoticed. But when suffering comes, things change very rapidly. One seeks the way out and begins to reflect about the meaning of life and its bewildering experiences. It is significant that, according to the statistics, the psychiatrist is consulted more by Protestants and Jews than by Catholics. This might be expected, for the Catholic Church still feels responsible for the cura animarum, the care of souls. But in this scientific age, the psychiatrist is apt to be asked questions that once belonged to the domain of the theologian. People feel that it makes, or would make, a great difference if only they had a meaningful way of life or in God and immortality. The of death looming up before them often gives a worthful incentive to such thoughts. From time immemorial, men have had ideas about a supreme MNG, one or several, and about the land of the hereafter. Only modern man thinks he can do without them, because he cannot discover throne in heaven with a telescolar or radar, or establish for certain that dear father or mother are still about in a more or less real form. He assumes that such ideas are not true. I would rather say that they are not true enough. They have accompanied human life since prehistoric times and are still ready to break through into consciousness at the slightest provo. One even regrets the loss of such convictions. Since it is a matter of invisible and unknowable things, God is beyond human understanding, and immortality cannot proved, why should we bother about evidence or truth? Suppose we did not know and understand the need salt in our F00D, we would nevertheless profit from its use. Even if we should assume that salt is an illusion of our taste buds, or it would still contribute to our well-being. Why, then, should we deprive ourselves of views that prove helpful in crises and give a meaning to our existence? And how do we know that such ideas are not true? Many would agree with me if I stated flatly that such ideas are illusions. What they fail to realize is that this denial amounts to a relief and is just as impossible to prove as a religious assertion. We are entirely free to our stand int, it will in any case be an arbitrary decision. There is, however, a strong empirical reason why we should hold beliefs that we know can never proved. It is that they are known to be useful. Man effectively needs general ideas and convictions that will give a meaning to his life and enable him to find his place in the universe. He can stand the most incredible hardships when he is convinced that they make sense, but he is crushed when, on top of all his misfortunes, he has to admit that he is taking part in a tale told by an idiot. It is the endeavor of religious symbols to give a meaning to the life of man. The Pueblo Indians believe that they are the sons of Father Sun, and this gives their life a perspective and a goal beyond their individual and limited existence. It leaves ample for the unfolding of their personality, and is infinitely more satisfactory than the certainty that one is and will remain the underdog in a department store. If St. Paul had been convinced that he was nothing but a wandering weaver of cacker, he would certainly not have been himself. His real and meaningful life lay in the certainty that he was the mess of the Lord. You can accuse him of megalomania, but your opinion pales for the testimony of history and the consensus omnium. The myth that took 9 sessions of him made him something greater than a mere craftsman. Myths, however, consist of symbols that were not invented, but it was not the man Jesus who created the myth of the it had existed many centuries before. He himself was seized by this symbolic idea, which, as St. Mark tells us, lifted him out of the shop and the mental narrowness of his surroundings. Myths go back to primitive storytellers and their dreams, to men moved by the stirrings of their fantasies, who were not very different from poets and philosophers in later times. Primitive storytellers never worried about the origin of their fantasies. It was only much later that people began to wonder where the story came from. Already in ancient Greece they were advanced enough to surmise that the stories were nothing but old and exaggerated traditions of ancient kings and their deeds. They assumed even then that the myth did not mean what it said. It was obviously improbable. Therefore they tried to reduce it to a generally understandable yarn. This is exactly what our time has tried to do with dream syrmism. It is assumed that it does not mean what it seems to say, but something that is generally known and understood, though not openly admitted of its inferior quality. For those who had got rid of their conventional blinkers, there were no longer any riddles. It seemed certain that dreams meant something different from what they said. This assumption is wholly arbitrary. The Talmud says more aptly, the dream is its own interpretation. Why should dreams mean something different from what in them? Is there anything in nature that is other than what it is? For instance, the duck-billed platypus, that original monster which no Zex.Ilkvist would ever have invented, is it not just what it is? The dream is a normal and natural phenomenon, which is certainly just what it is, and does not mean something it is not. We call its contents syrr Mike Irakowsk. They have obviously not only one meaning, but point in different directions and must therefore mean something that is unconscious, or at least not conscious in all its aspects. To the scientific mind, such phenomena as symbolic ideas are most irritating, because they cannot formulate it in a way that satisfies our logic. They are by no means the only instance of this in psychology. The trouble begins already with the phenomenon of affect or emotion, which evades all the attempts of the psychologist to pin it down in a concept. The cause of the difficulty is the same in cases the intervention of the unconscious. I know enough of the scientific standpoint to understand that it is most annoying to have to deal with facts that cannot grasped completely or at any rate adequately. The trouble with phenomena is that the facts are undeniable and yet cannot formulated in intellectual terms. Instead of observable details with clearly discernible features, it is life itself that wells up in emotions and SYMLX-like ideas. In many cases emotion and SYMTXL are actually one and the same thing. There is no intellectual formula capable of representing such a complex phenomenon in a satisfactory way. The academic psychologist is perfectly free to dismiss the emotions or the unconscious, or both, from his consideration. Yet they remain facts to which at least the medical psychologist has to pay ample attention, for emotional conflicts and the interventions of the unconscious are the classical features of his science. If he treats a patient at all, he is confronted with irrationalities of this kind whether he can formulate them intellectually or not. He has to acknowledge their only troublesome existence. It is therefore quite natural that people who have not had the medical psychologist's experience find it difficult to follow what he is talking about. Anyone who has not had the chance, or the misfortune, to live through the same or similar experiences is hardly capable of understanding what happens when psychology ceases to be a tranquil pursuit for the scientist in his laboratory and here comes a real-life adventure. Target practice on a shooting range is far from mirroring a battlefield, but the doctor has to deal with casualties in a real war. Therefore he has to concern himself with psychic realities even if he cannot define them in scientific terms. He can name them, but he knows that all the terms he uses to designate the essentials of life do not pretend to be more than names for facts that have to exist in themselves, because they cannot be reproduced by their names. No textbook can teach psychology, one learns only by actual experience. No understanding is gained by memorizing words. For SYMLX.ls are the living facts of life. The cross in the Christian religion, for instance, is a meaningful symbol that expresses a multitude of ideas and emotions, but across somebody's name simply indicates that that individual is dead. The lingam or phallus functions as an all-embracing symbol in the Hindu religion, but if a street urchin draws one on a wall, it just means an interest in his X-ness. Because infantile and adolescent fantasies often continue far into adult life, many dreams contain unmistakable sexual signs. Would be absurd to understand them as anything else. But when a Mason speaks of monks and nuns to be laid each other, or Ulksmith of male and female keys, it would nonsensical to see that he is indulging in glowing adolescent fantasies. He simply means a particular kind of tile or key that has been given a colorful name. But when an educated Hindu talks to you the lingam, you will hear things we Westerners would never connect with the nis. You may even find it most difficult to guess what he actually means by this term, and you will naturally conclude that the lingam symbolizes a good many things. It is certainly not an obscene illusion, nor is the cross a mere sign for death but a symbol for a great many other ideas. Much, therefore, depends on the maturity of the dreamer who produces such an image. The interpretation of dreams requires some intelligence. It cannot be mechanized and crammed into stupid and unimaginative brains. It demands an ever-increasing knowledge of the dreamer's individuality as well as an ever-increasing self-awareness on the part of the interpreter. No experienced worker in this field will deny that there are rules of thumb that can prove helpful, but they must be applied with prudence and intelligence. Not everybody can master the technique. You may follow all the right rules and the apparently safe path of knowledge and yet you get stuck in the most appalling nonsense, simply by a seemingly unimportant detail that a better intelligence would not have missed. Even a man with a highly developed intellect can go badly astray because he has never learned to use his intuition or his feeling, which might be at a regrettably low level of development. The attempt to understand D.Rs not only bring you up against the symbol itself, but up against the wholeness of the symbol-producing individual. If one is really up to this challenge, one may meet with success. But as a rule it will be necessary to make a special study of the individual and his or her cultural background. One can learn a lot in this way and so get a chance to fill in the gaps in one's education. I have made it a rule myself to consider every case an entirely new proposition which I do not even know the ABC routine may and often is practical, and quite useful as long as one skates on the surface, but as one gets in touch with the vital problems life itself takes over and even the most brilliant theoretical premises become ineffectual words. This makes the teaching of N techniques a major problem. As I have said, the pupil has to acquire a deal of knowledge. This provides him with the necessary mental but the main thing. The handling of the kin acquired only if the pupil undergoes an analysis that acquaints him with his own conflict. This can be quite a task with some so-called normal but unimaginative individuals. They are just incapable of realizing, for instance, the simple fact that psychic events happen to us. Such people prefer to cling to the idea that whatever occurs either is done by themselves or else is pathological and must be cured by pills or injections. They show how dull normality is to a neurosis, and as a matter of HCT such succumb most easily to psychic epidemics. In all the higher grades of science, imagination and intuition play an increasingly urgent role over and above intellect and its capacity for application. Even physics, the most rigorous of all the applied sciences, DQRNDS to an astonishing degree on intuition, which works by way of the unconscious premises and not by logical deductions, although it is to demonstrate afterwards what logical procedure might have led to the same result. Intuition is almost indispensable in the interpretation of symbols, and can cause an immediate acceptance on the part of the dreamer. But, subjectively convincing as such a lucky hunch may, it is also somewhat dangerous, because it leads to a false sense of security. It may even seduce both the interpreter and the dreamer into continuing this rather facile exchange of ideas, which may end in a sort of mutual dream. The secure basis of real intellectual and moral knowledge gets lost if one is satisfied with a vague feeling of having understood. Usually when one asks RMJPL the reasons for their so-called understanding, they are unable to give an explanation. One can understand and explain only when one has brought intuitions down to the safe basis of real knowledge of the facts and their logical connections. An honest investigator will have to admit that this is not possible in certain cases, but it would be dishonest of him to dismiss them on that account. Even a scientist is a human, and it is quite natural that he, like others, hates the things he cannot explain and thus falls victim to the common illusion that what we know represents the highest summit of knowledge. Nothing is more vulnerable and ephemeral than scientific theories, which are mere and not everlasting truths. 7. Healing the split. When the medical psychologist takes an interest in symbols, he is primarily concerned with natural, as distinct from cultural symbols. The former are derived from the uncontents of the psyche, and they therefore represent an enormous number of variations on the basic archetypal motifs. In many cases, they can trace back to their archaic, i.e., to ideas and images that we meet in the most ancient records and in primitive societies. In this respect, I should like to call the reader's attention to such as Mircea Eliade's study of shamanism, where a great many illuminating examples may be cultural SYMTLS. On the other hand, are those that have expressed eternal truths, or are still in use in many religions. They have gone through many transformations and even a process of more or less conscious ration, and in this way have become the representations collectives of civilized societies. Nevertheless, they have retained much of their original numinosity, and they function as or negative prejudices with which they has to reckon very seriously. Nobody can dismiss these numinous factors on merely rational grounds. They are irritant constituents of our mental makeup and vital forces in the building up of human society, and they cannot be eradicated without serious loss. When they are repressed or neglected, their specific energy disappears into the unconscious with unpredictable. The energy that to have been lost revives and intensifies whatever is up frm0st in the unconscious tendencies, per h. that have hitherto had no chance to express themselves, or have not allowed an uninhibited existence in our consciousness. They form an ever-present destructive shadow. Even tendencies that might able to exert an influence turn into veritable demons when they are repressed. This is why many well-meaning people are understandably afraid of the unconscious, and incidentally of psychology. Our times have demonstrated what it means when the gates of the psychic underworld are thrown open. Things whose now mighty no Huxley could have imagined in the idyllic innings of the first decade of our century have hammered and have turned the world upside down. Ever since, the world has remained in a state of schizophrenia. Not only has the great civilized Germany disgorged its primitivity, but Russia also is ruled by it, and Africa has set on fire. No wonder the Western world feels uneasy, for it not know how much it plays into the hands of the uproarious underworld and what it has lost through the destruction of its numinosities. It has lost its moral and spiritual values to a very dangerous degree. Its moral and spiritual tradition has collapsed, and has left a worldwide disorientation and discreation. We could have long ago from primitive scrietes what the loss of numinosity means. They lose their raison d'etre, the order of their sxial organizations, and then they dissolve and decay. We are now in the same condition. We have lost something we have never properly understood. Our spiritual leaders cannot spare the blame for having been more interested in protecting their institutions than in understanding the mystery that symbols present. Faith not exclude thought, which is man's strongest weapon, but unfortunately many irevers are so afraid of science, and also of psychology, that they turn a blind eye to the nutin in zero wares that forever control man's fate. We have stripped all things of their mystery and numinosity, nothing is holy any longer. The masses and their leaders do not realize that it makes no substantial difference whether you call the world principle male and a father, spirit, or female and a mother, matter. Entirely, we know as little of the one as of the other. Since the of the human mind were numinous symbols, and their importance lay in their numinosity and not in their or other chance attributes. Since energy never vanishes, the emotional energy that manifests itself in all numinous phenomena not cease to exist when it from consciousness. As I have said, it reappears in unconscious manifestations. In symbolic that compensate the disturbances of the conscious psyche. Our psyche is profoundly disturbed by the loss of moral and spiritual values that have hitherto kept our life in order. Our consciousness is no longer capable of integrating the natural amux of concomitant, instinctive events that sustains our conscious psychic activity. This process can no longer take place in the same way as before, because our consciousness has deprived itself of the organs by which the auxiliary contributions of the instincts and the unconscious could be assimilated. These organs were the numinous held holy by common a concept like physical matter, of its numinous connotation of the Great Mother, no longer expresses the vast emotional meaning of Mother Earth. It is a mere intellectual term, dry as dust and entirely inhuman. In the same way, spirit identified with intellect ceases to be the father of all. It degenerates into the limited mind of man, and the immense emotional energy expressed in the image Our Father vanishes in the sand of an intellectual desert. Through scientific understanding, our world has become dehumanized. Man feels himself isolated in the cosmos. He is no longer involved in nature and has lost his emotional participation in natural events, which hitherto had a symbolic meaning for him. Thunder is no longer the voice of a GTXL, nor is lightning his avenging missile. No river contains a spirit, no tree means a man's life, no snake is the embodiment of wisdom, and no mountain still harlks urs a great demon. Neither do things s fact to him nor kin he to things, like stones, springs, plants, and animals. He no longer has a bush soul identifying him with a wild animal. His immediate communication with nature is gone forever, and the emotional energy it generated has sunk into the unconscious. This enormous loss is in our dreams. They bring up our original nature, its instincts, and its thinking. Unfortunately, one would say, they also express their contents in the language of nature, which is strange and incomprehensible to us. It sets us the task of translating its images into the rational words and concepts of MC Slurn Sfect, which has liberated itself from its primitive encumbrances, notably from its mystical participation with things. Nowadays, talking of ghosts and other numinous figures is no longer the same as conjuring them up. We have ceased to declive in magical formulas, not many tathses and similar restrictions are left, and our world seems to be disinfected of all such superstitious noumena as witches, warhusks, and wercows, to say nothing of werewolves, vampires, bush souls, and all the other bizarre beings that populate the primeval forest. At least the surface of our world seems to purified of all superstitious and irrational admixtures. Whether, however, the real inner world of man and not our wish-fulfilling fiction about it is also freed from primitivity is another question. Is not the Numelsar still for many fr opal? Are there not still many individuals assessed by funny prejudices, projections, and illusions? A realistic picture of the human mind reveals many primitive traits and survivals, which are still playing their roles just as if nothing had happened during the last 500 years. The man of today is a curious mixture of characteristics acquired over the long ages of his mental development. This is the man and his SYMTLS we have to deal with. And we must scrutinize his mental products very carefully indeed. Sep. To call viewpoints and scientific convictions exist in him side by side with old-fashioned prejudices, outdated habits of thought and feeling, obstinate misinterpretations, and blind ignorance. Such are the people who perclose the sin ms we are investigating in their dreams. In order to explain the simtx.ls and their meaning, it is essential to learn whether these representations are still the same as they ever were, or whether they have been chosen by the dream for its particular purpose from a store of general conscious knowledge. If, for instance, one has to deal with a dream in which the NumLRR13 occurs, the question is, DCRS the dreamer habitually believe in the unfavorable nature of the NumLR, or does the dream merely allude to people who still indulge in such? The answer will make a great difference to the interpretation. In the former case, the dreamer is still under the of the unlucky 13, and will therefore feel most uncomfortable in RXRN number 13 or sitting at a table with 13. In the latter case, May 13th not more than a chiding or remark. In one case it is a still numinous representation, in the other it is stripped of its original emotionality and has assumed the innocuous character of a mere piece of indifferent information. This illustrates the way in which archetypes s appear in practical xj. In the first case in their original form they are images and at the same time emotions. One can have an archetype only when these two aspects coincide. When there is only an image, it is merely a word picture, like a corpuscle with no electric charge. It is then of little consequence, just a word and nothing more. But if the image is charged with numinosity, that is, with psychic energy, then it becomes dynamic and will perclose consequences. It is a great mistake in practice to treat an archetype as if it were a mere name, word, or concept. It is far more than that. It is a piece of life, an image connected with the living individual by the bridge of emotion. The word alone is a mere abstraction, an exchangeable coin in intellectual commerce. But the archetypal asterisk is living matter. It is not limitlessly exchangeable but always longs to the economy of a living individual, from which it can not be detached and used arbitrarily for different ends. It cannot be explained in just any way, but only in the one that is indicated by that particular individual. Thus the SYMTX, L of the cross, in the case of a Christian, can be interpreted only in the Christian way unless the dream produces very strong reasons to the contrary, and even then the specifically Christian meaning should not be lost sight of. The mere use of words is futile if you do not know what they stand for. This is particularly true in psychology, where we have like the anima and animus, the wise old man, the great mother, and so on. You can know about all the saints, sages, prophets, and other GCXLLY men, and all the great mothers of the world, but if they are mere images whose numinosity you have never, it will as if you were talking in a dream, for you do not know what you are talking about. The words you use are empty and valueless, and they gain life and meaning only when you try to learn about their numenos ity, their relationship to the living individual. Then only do you begin to understand that the names mean very little, but that the way they are related to you is all important. The symbol-producing function of our dreams is an attempt to bring our original mind back to consciousness, where it has never been before, and where it has never undergone critical self-reflection. We have been that mind, but we have never known it. We got rid of it before understanding it. It rose from its cradle, shedding its primitive characteristics like cumbersome and valueless husks. It is as if the unconscious represented the of these remnants. Dreams and their continually refer to them, as if they intended to bring back all the old primitive things from which the mind freed itself in the course of its evolution: illusions, childish fantasies, archaic thought forms, primitive instincts. This is in reality the case, and it explains the resistance, even fear and horror, one experiences in approaching the unconscious. One is shocked less by the primitivity of its contents than by their emotionality. They are not merely neutral or indifferent, they are so charged with affect that they are often exceedingly uncomfortable. They can even cause real panic, and the more they are repressed the more they spread through the whole personality in the form of a neurosis. It is just their emotionality, however, that gives them such a vital dance. It is as if a man who has lived through a period of life in an unconscious state should suddenly realize that there is a gap in his memory, that important events to have taken place that he cannot remember. Insofar as he assumes that the psyche is an exclusively affair, and this is the usual assumption, he will try to retrieve the apparently lost infantile memories. But the in his childo-XL memories are merely the symptoms of a much greater loss, the loss of the primitive psyche, the psyche that lived and functioned TX, for it was reflected by consciousness. As the evolution of the embryonic refats its prehistory, so the mind grows up through the series of its prehistoric stages. Dreams seem to consider it their main task to bring back a sort of recollection of the prehistoric as well as the infantile world, right down to the level of the most primitive instincts, as if such memories were a priceless treasure. And these memories can indeed have a remarkably healing effect in certain cases, as Freud saw long ago. This observation confirms the view that an infantile memory gap, a so-called amnesia, amounts to a definite loss, and that its recovery brings an increase in vitality and well-being. Since we measure a child's life by thepacity and simplicity of its contents, we do not appreciate the far-reaching complexities of the infantile mind that stem from its original identity with the prehistoric psyche. That original mind is just as much present and still functioning in the child as the evolutionary stages are in the embryo. If the reader remembers what I said earlier, the child who made a present of her dreams to her father, he will get a goxlow idea of what I mean. In infantile amnesia, one finds strange admixtures of mythological fragments that also often in later psyches. Images of this kind are highly numinous and therefore very tant. If such recollections reappear in adult life, they may in some cases cause profound psychological disturbances, while in other they can produce astonishing cures or religious conversions. Often they bring back a piece of life, missing for a long time, that enriches the life of an individual. The recollection of infantile memories and the repercussion of archetypal modes of psychic functioning create a wider horizon and a greater extension of consciousness, provided that one succeeds in assimilating and integrating the lost and regained contents. Since they are not neutral, their assimilation will mcxle even as they themselves will have to undergo certain alterations. In this part of the individuation process, the interpretation of symbols plays an redundant practical role, for the symbols are natural attempts to reconcile and reunite often widely separated outsides, as is apparent from the contradictory nature of many symbols. It would be a particularly obnoxious error in this work of assimilation if the interpreter were to take only the conscious memories as true or real, while considering the archetypal contents as merely fantastic representations. Dreams and their ambiguous SYMLM, LSO their forms on the one hand to repressed contents and on the other to archetypes. They thus have two AWTS and enable one to interpret in two ways, one lays the emphasis either on their or on their archetypal aspect. The former shows the morbid influence of repressed and infantile wishes, while the latter hints to the sound instinctive basis. However fantastic the archetypal contents may be, they represent emotional wares or numinous ties. If one should try to brush them aside, they would only get repressed and would create the same neurotic condition as B. 4. Their numinosity gives the contents an autonomous nature. This is a fact that cannot be denied. If it is nevertheless denied, the regained contents are annihilated and any attempt at a synthesis is futile. But it appears to be attempting way out, and therefore it is often chosen. Not only is the existence of archetypes denied, but even those irople who do admit their existence usually treat them as if they were mere images and forget that they are living entities that make up a great part of the human psyche. As soon as the interpreter strips them of their numinosity, they lose their life and become mere words. It is then easy enough to link them together with other mythological representations, and so the process of limitless substitution begins. One glides from archetype to archetype, everything means everything, and one has reduced the whole process to absurdity. All the corpses in the world are chemically identical, but living individuals are not. It is true that the forms of Archie5Fs are to a considerable extent interchangeable, but their numinosity is and remains a fact. It represents the value of an archetypal event. This emotional value must be kept in mind and allowed for throughout the whole intellectual process of interpretation. The risk of losing it is great. Thinking and feeling are so diametrically opposite said that thinking abolishes feeling values and vice versa. Psychology is the only science that has to take the factor of value, feeling, into account, since it forms the link between psychic events on the one hand, and meaning and life on the other. Our intellect has created a new world that dominates nature, and has populated it with monstrous machines. The latter are so indubitably useful and so much needed that we cannot see even a irksability of getting rid of them or of our subservience to them. Man is eisend to follow the exploits of his scientific and inventive mind and to admire himself for his splendid achievements. At the same time, he cannot help admitting that his genetics shows an uncanny tendency to invent things that become more and more dangerous, because they represent better and better means for wholesale suicide. In view of the rapidly increasing avalanche of world population, we have already begun to seek ways and means of keeping the rising at bay. But nature may anticipate all our attempts by turning against man his own creative mind, and, by releasing the H-bomb or some equally catastrophic device, put an effective stop to overpopulation. In spite of our proud domination of nature, we are still her victims as much as ever and have not even learned to control our own nature, which slowly and inevitably courts dis. There are no longer any GRXLs whom we can invoke to help us. The great religions of the world suffer from increasing anemia, cause the helpful noumena have fled from the rivers, mountains, and animals, and the god-men have disappeared underground into the unconscious. There we supplesse they lead an ignominious existence among the relics of our past, while we remain dominated by the great Messe Raison, who is our overwhelming illusion. With her aid we are doing laudable things, we rid the world of malaria, we spread hygiene everywhere, with the result that populations increase at such a rate that is becoming a problem. We have conquered nature is a mere slogan. In reality we are confronted with anxious questions, the answers to which seem nowhere in sight. The so-called conquest of nature overwhelms us with the natural fact of overpopulation and makes our troubles more or less unmanageable because of our psychological incapacity to reach the necessary political agreements. It remains quite natural for men to quarrel and fight and struggle for superiority over one another. Where indeed have we conquered nature? As any change must somewhere, it is the single individual who will undergo it and carry it through. The change must begin with one individual, it might be any one of us. No BCXLY can afford to k around and to wait for some LMXLY else to do what he is loath to do himself. As Nobxly knows what he could do, he might be enough to ask himself whether by any chance his unconscious might know something helpful, when there is no satisfactory conscious answer anywhere in sight. Manchksley is painfully aware of the fact that neither his great religions nor his various philosophies seem to provide him with those powerful ideas that would give him the certainty and security in face of the present condition of the world. I know that the Buddhists would say, as indeed they do, if only would follow the noble eightfold path of the Dharma, Dxtrine, law, and had true insight into the Christians, if only Iropal had the right faith in the Lord, or the rationalists, if only people could be intelligent and reason able, then all problems would be manageable and solvable. The trouble is that none of them manages to solve these problems himself. Christians often ask why God DCRS not Sirach to them, as he is believed to have done in former days. When I hear such questions, it always makes me think of the rabbi who was asked how it could that God often showed himself to people in the olden days but that nowadays one no longer saw him. The rabbi replied, "Nor is there anyone nowadays who could stoop so low." This answer hits the nail on the head. We are so captivated by and entangled in our subjective consciousness that we have simply forgotten the age-old fact that God speaks chiefly through dreams and visions. The Buddhist discards the world of unconscious fantasies as distractions and useless illusions. The Christian puts his church and his Bible between himself and his unconscious, and the rationalist intellectual does not yet know that his consciousness is not his total psyche, in spite of the fact that for more than 70 years the unconscious has been a basic scientific concept that is indispensable to any serious student of psychology. We can no longer afford to so GCXL our ideas to set ourselves up as judges of the merits or demerits of natural phenomena. We do not base our botany on a division into useful and useless plants, or on a classification into harmless and dangerous animals. But we still go on blithely assuming that consciousness is sense and the unconscious is nonsense, as if you could make out whether any natural phenomenon makes sense or not. Do microbes, for instance, make sense or nonsense? Such evaluations merely demonstrate the lamentable state of our mind, which conceals its ignorance and incompetence under the cloak of megalomania. Certainly are very small and most despicable, but it would be folly to know nothing them. Whatever else the unconscious may be, it is a natural phenomenon that produces symbols, and these symbols prove to meaningful. We cannot exect someone who has never lcxked through a to be an authority on microbes. In the same way, no one who has not made a serious study of natural symbols can considered a competent judge in this matter. But general undervaluation of the human psyche is so great that neither the great religions nor the philosophies nor scientific rationalism have been willing to admit twice. In spite of the fact that the Catholic Church admits the occurrence of dreams sent by God, most of its thinkers make no attempt to understand them. I also doubt whether there is a Protestant treatise on dogmatics that would stoop so low as to consider the possibility that the vox dei might in a dream. But if some really in God, by what authority does he suggest that is unable to interact through dreams? I have sirnt more than half a century investigating natural symbols, and I have come to the conclusion that dreams and their symtxls are not stupid and meaningless. On the contrary, dreams provide you with the interesting information if only take the trouble to understand their results, it is true, have little to do with such worldly concerns as buying and selling. But the meaning of life is not exhaustively explained by your business activities, nor is the deep desire of the human heart answered by your bank account, even if you have never heard of anything else. At a time when all available energy is spent in the investigation of nature, very little attention is paid to the essence of man, which is his psyche, although many researches are made into its conscious functions. But the really unknown part, which produces symbols, is still virtually unexplored. We receive signals from it every night, yet deciphering these communications seems to be such a task that very few in the whole civilized world can with it. Man's greatest instrument, his psyche, is little thought of, if not actually mistrusted and despised. Its only psychological often means, it is nothing. Where, exactly, this immense prejudice come from? We have obviously been so busy with the question of what we think that we entirely forget what the unconscious psyche thinks about us. Freud made a serious attempt to show why the unconscious deserves no better judgment, and his teachings have inadvertently increased and confirmed the existing contempt for the psyche. Before him it had been merely overall Sicht and Neglect, now it has become a dump for moral refuse and a source of fear. This modern is surely one-sided and unjust. It not even accord with the known facts. Our actual knowledge of the unconscious shows it to be a natural phenomenon, and that, like nature herself, it is at least neutral. It contains all of human nature, light and dark, beautiful and ugly, good and evil, profound and silly, the study of individual as well as collective SYMTH. Lism is an enormous task, and one that has not yet been mastered. But at last it has been made. The results so far gained are encouraging, and they seem to indicate an answer to many of the questions present and de mankind.